I still work night shifts at Appalachian Ridge State Park, but I no longer work them alone. The park administration changed that policy 2 months after I started. They said it was about budget reallocation and staffing efficiency, but nobody who was actually there believes that. The 6 rules that were written down in that handover meeting are still in effect. They are printed on a laminated card that I keep in my jacket. I follow them exactly every single night because I understand now what happens when you do not. If you work in parks or forests, if you have received unwritten instructions from supervisors that made no practical sense, if you have a location on your usual route that you started avoiding without consciously deciding to avoid it, subscribe and share this with someone who thinks they would have handled the rules better than I did. If you want to hear the accounts from the previous rangers who worked that station, the ones who left incomplete incident reports and never returned to the job, that content is available for channel members who want access to the archived case files. My name is Thomas, and I had been working park service jobs for 5 years before I transferred to night shift patrol at Appalachian Ridge. I had worked the Cumberland Range for 2 seasons, doing trail maintenance and visitor management during the day shift, and the work was straightforward. But in early 2022, there was an opening in the ranger station for overnight security and patrol. The position paid better, offered more autonomy, and promised something I needed at that time-long stretches of solitude. I had gone through a divorce that left me needing distance from people, and the idea of spending my nights alone in the quiet of the park seemed like exactly what I required. I was hired in March. The station itself is located about 4 miles from the main park entrance, accessible by a single gravel road that winds through dense forest. The building is small, maybe 1,500 square feet, constructed in the 1980s from stone and wood. It has a small office with a radio console, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a sleeping area with 2 cots. There is a generator in the back that runs the lights and the radio equipment. During the day, the station serves as a base for ranger activities. During the night, it becomes a solitary post. My supervisor during the day shift was a woman named Helen, who had worked for the Park Service for 22 years. She was professional and distant, someone who believed in doing things by procedure. Helen spent my first week showing me the equipment, the radio frequencies, the emergency protocols, and the general layout of the patrol routes. She explained the incident log system, the supply management, the equipment checks. Everything was standard, organized, and sensible. On my last day of day shift training, Helen told me that I would be meeting with the park director, Michael Vance, to review the night shift operations. Michael's office was in the main administrative building, a larger structure near the park entrance. I drove there in the late afternoon, curious about what the director of a mid-sized state park would want to discuss with the new overnight ranger. Michael was in his 50s, with silver hair and a cautious demeanor. He had worked for the Park Service for nearly 3 decades. When I entered his office, he did not offer me coffee or small talk. He closed the door and opened a drawer in his desk. He pulled out a laminated card and placed it on the desk facing me. He said, "Before you work your first night shift alone, you need to understand these 6 rules. They are not suggestions. They are not guidelines. They are requirements for the position." I remember that his hands were steady, but there was something in his jaw that suggested he did not enjoy this conversation. I looked at the card. The rules were printed in a clear sans serif font. They were dated 1994. I am mentioning that because it became important later. The first rule was, do not answer the radio after sunset. I looked up at Michael and asked what that meant. He said that the radio would still function after sunset, that calls might come in from other ranger stations or from park administration, but that I was not to respond to them. If the radio transmitted a message after dark, I was to note the timestamp in the log, but not answer. He said this very carefully, like he was choosing each word. I told him that seemed unusual. that emergency communication was supposed to be a two-way process. He said, "It is still a two-way process, just not between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. If there is a genuine emergency, they will send a ranger to the station in person." The second rule was, stay inside the station between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Michael explained that during those hours, I was not to leave the building except in a documented emergency. I was not to conduct exterior patrols. I was not to check on the equipment outside. I was to remain indoors. I asked if there was a specific security concern, a location issue, a wildlife problem. He said that the rule had been in place for almost 30 years, and that there had never been a documented emergency that required me to be outside during those hours. He also said that if I somehow found myself outside during those times, I was to return to the station immediately and note the incident in the log. The third rule was, do not go to the Northern Trail section after dark, ever. The Northern Trail was one of the standard visitor routes, a well-maintained path that wound through a particularly scenic valley. The trail was popular during the day. Michael said that after sunset, the Northern Trail section was not to be accessed. If visitors were still on the trail at sunset, which was uncommon, I was to note their position and they would be contacted the next morning if they did not return to the parking area by a specific time. This rule actually made more practical sense to me than the others. Night hiking could be dangerous. Turning back a solo hiker seemed reasonable. The fourth rule was, do not acknowledge sounds that call your name. I remember pausing when I read that one. I asked Michael to clarify. He said that during night patrols or while alone at the station, I might hear sounds that seemed to be calling my name or attempting to communicate with me. I was not to respond to these sounds. I was not to go toward them. I was to note the time and location if possible and continue with my duties. He added that the sounds had never resulted in anything dangerous, but that acknowledging them or responding to them might change that pattern. I told him that sounded like either a prank or an animal behavior issue. He did not argue with me. The fifth rule was, keep the lights on at all times inside the station. Michael explained that every interior light was to remain on throughout the night. The office lights, the kitchenette lights, the bathroom lights, all of them. The only exception was if there was a documented power failure from the generator. If lights went out for any reason other than mechanical failure, I was to turn them back on immediately. The electricity cost was paid by the park, so this was not about conservation. Michael said the rule was simply to be followed without exception. The sixth rule was, do not look out the western window. The station has 3 windows. One faces north toward the parking area and the access road. One faces south toward the forest interior. The western window faces a cliff edge about 200 meters away. The cliff is unremarkable, covered in trees and stone. Michael said that I was not to look out the western window at any time, day or night. If I needed to verify the weather or check on exterior conditions, I should use the north or south windows. The western window should not be approached or looked through. I asked why. Michael said it was another long-standing rule, and the reason was not something I needed to understand. I just needed to follow it. I sat there holding that card, looking at these 6 rules, and I felt something shift in my understanding of what this job actually was. I said to Michael, these seem less like operational procedures and more like restrictions based on something you already know has happened. Michael looked directly at me and said, I am not going to tell you that these rules exist for a documented reason. I am going to tell you that these rules exist because they work. There have been 5 rangers who worked this night shift before you. There are 4 rangers who still work for the Park Service. The one who did not is no longer in contact with anyone. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, you will follow these rules. If you cannot commit to following them exactly, I need to know now, and I will hire someone else for this position. I wanted to ask him what had happened to the 5th ranger. I wanted to know what violation had resulted in that consequence. I also needed the job. I was 9 months from paying off my divorce settlement. I had no other income. I said that I would follow the rules exactly as they were written. Michael nodded, put the card back in his drawer, and pulled out a copy for me to keep. He said that my first night shift would be the following day. He said that Helen would check on me by radio at regular intervals for the first week. He said that if I needed to contact him for any reason, I had his personal number. Then I was dismissed. I drove back to my apartment, thinking about the man who had stopped working for the Park Service. I tried to find information about him online. I checked Park Service records, local news, the park's staff roster from the previous years. There was a gap. From 2016 to 2017, a ranger named Arthur Chen had worked the night shift at Appalachian Ridge Station. The roster showed him transferring to a different park in 2018, but when I checked that park's records, there was no Arthur Chen listed. I kept looking until I found a news article from 2017 about someone named Arthur Chen, age 31, who had been found on a rural road in Madison County with severe trauma. The article did not specify how he had been injured. It said he was hospitalized for 2 months and his current status was unknown. It did not say he had worked for the Park Service. I did not mention any of this to anyone. I showed up for my first night shift the next evening. The first week of night shifts established the routine. I arrived at 6 p.m., reviewed the equipment logs, ate dinner in the kitchenette, and began monitoring the radio while reviewing incident reports from the previous months. Nothing exciting happened. No emergency calls came in. No incident reports documented anything unusual. The night patrols were uneventful. I would conduct a quick walk around the exterior of the station at dusk before the restricted hours began. I would check that the gate to the access road was secure, that there was no debris or damage to the building, that the generator was functioning properly. Then I would come back inside at 10 p.m., turn on all the interior lights, and wait for the night to pass. Helen checked on me by radio every 2 hours during that first week. Her voice would crackle through at 8 p.m., 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m. She would say my name and ask for a status report. I would respond that everything was normal. She would log it and disconnect. There was never conversation beyond that. By the end of the week, Helen's check-ins felt like the most interaction I had with another human being. I was beginning to understand the appeal of the solitude. I was also beginning to realize that the solitude came with a cost. On the 8th night of my employment, I tested the first rule. I was monitoring the radio at around 8:30 p.m. when a transmission came through from a ranger station about 10 miles north. The transmission was asking for a status update on a vehicle that had entered the park and failed to exit by closing time. The voice on the radio was calm and procedural. They were asking if I had observed the vehicle leaving during my patrols or if I had any information about its location. According to the rule, I was not supposed to answer, but the rule was about not answering after sunset, and sunset was at 7:27 p.m. This was already after sunset. I sat there listening to the radio ask the same question twice more, with increasing formality each time. The third time, the ranger asked if the Appalachian Ridge Station was operating normally. I answered. I said that I had not observed the vehicle in question, and that I had no information about its status. The other ranger thanked me and asked me to monitor for the vehicle and report if it appeared. I said I would. The radio disconnected. I felt guilty and relieved in equal measure. No disaster occurred. The vehicle was probably simply parked in a late-day lot and would be retrieved by its owner in the morning. But I made a note of the incident in the log, and I mentioned it to Helen during her next check-in. She asked me if I had answered the radio after sunset. I said yes, briefly, for what I thought was legitimate information. Helen said, "Michael will need to know about this." She sounded concerned in a way that her professional tone usually masked. I asked if answering one radio call was going to be a problem. Helen said, "It is not the call that will be a problem. It is whether anything happens because you answered." She told me to note it in the log and that she would mention it to Michael. Then she disconnected. I waited to hear if there would be consequences. Nothing happened. The vehicle incident resolved itself when the owner arrived the next morning to pick up their car. No other rangers contacted me. Michael did not call to reprimand me. The night shift continued as before. But the next night, something changed. I want to be precise about what I experienced, because the order matters, and the sequence is what finally proved that these rules existed for a reason. It was the 9th night of my employment. Helen called at 8 p.m. as usual. I gave her the normal status report. She disconnected. At 8:30 p.m., I was in the office reviewing incident logs when I heard something that sounded like my name being called from outside the building. It was distant, muffled by the walls and the forest, but it was unmistakably someone calling Thomas. Not aggressive, not threatening, just my name from somewhere in the dark. I ignored it. I did not acknowledge it. I continued reading the logs. At 9 p.m., I heard it again. This time it was closer, or it sounded closer. Thomas. It had a slight echo to it, like it was coming from multiple directions. I considered the possibility that it was Helen testing my adherence to the rules, or another ranger conducting some kind of onboarding prank. I did not answer. I did not go to the window. I stayed inside with all the lights on, and I pretended I had not heard anything. At 9:30 p.m., just before the 11 p.m. lockdown period, I decided to walk around the exterior of the station one final time to verify that everything was secure. This was not against the rules. The rules did not restrict evening patrols, only the hours between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. I put on my jacket and went outside. The temperature had dropped significantly since I had last checked. The forest was darker than I expected, even with my flashlight. I walked around the perimeter of the building, checking the windows and doors, ensuring they were all locked. Everything appeared normal. As I turned the corner toward the western side of the building, I remembered the 6th rule. Do not look out the western window. I was not looking out of it. I was on the exterior, but I was near it, and I could see the western window from where I was standing. The window was dark. All the interior lights were on, but the western window appeared to be darker than it should have been, like there was something blocking it from the inside. I moved my flashlight beam to look more carefully, and I saw something that made me stop moving. There was a handprint on the interior of the western window. It was a human handprint, dark against the glass, positioned at about neck height if someone were standing inside the building looking out. Except I had been inside the building the entire time, and there was no one else there. The handprint had not been there when I had come outside. I had walked past that window to get outside, and it had been clean glass and clear view of the western cliff face. I went back inside immediately. I checked every room in the station. I looked in the office, the kitchenette, the bathroom, the storage area, under both cots, in every enclosed space. I was alone. There was nobody in the building. I went back to the western window and examined it from the inside. The handprint was real. It was wet, still fresh, with water running down in thin rivulets toward the windowsill. The window itself was locked from the inside. It had not been opened. The handprint was on the interior surface, which meant it had been placed there from inside the building, which meant someone had been inside the building with me and had somehow left without me seeing them. I called Helen. This was outside the normal check-in schedule, and I knew that violating protocol by calling early might raise concerns, but this seemed like a situation that merited immediate contact. Helen answered on the second ring and asked what the problem was. I told her about the handprint. I heard her take a breath. She said, "Did you respond to the sounds that called your name?" I said no. I told her that I had heard something calling my name twice, but that I had followed the rule and did not acknowledge it. Helen said, "That is probably what saved you from something worse." She told me to wipe down the handprint, clean the window thoroughly, and note the incident in the log with precise timing. She said that Michael would be informed and that I would need to stay at the station overnight as usual because stepping outside after the locked hours would violate protocol. She told me to keep all the lights on and to make sure every door and window was locked. I said I had already done that. She said to lock them again. She said this very slowly, like she wanted me to understand that locks were not primarily about keeping things out. The handprint disappeared from the inside of the window. There was no water residue left. It was gone, as thoroughly as if it had never been there. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the office with the lights on and the radio volume set so that I could hear any transmission clearly. No sounds called my name again. No other anomalies occurred. At 7 a.m., Helen came to the station in person for the first time. Helen brought coffee and sat at the desk across from me. She looked more tired than I had ever seen her. She asked me how I was feeling. I told her the truth, that I was frightened, that something I did not understand was happening at the station, and that I wanted to know what was actually going on. Helen was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Michael told me you had violated the first rule. I knew he would tell me eventually. I also knew you would eventually see something that would make you want answers." I asked her what the previous ranger, the one who had left the Park Service, had experienced. Helen said that Arthur Chen had worked the night shift for about 3 months before something happened that he could not process or explain. She said Arthur had broken all the rules in a single night. He had answered the radio. He had gone outside after 11 p.m. He had acknowledged the sounds that called his name. He had looked out the western window. Helen said that the next morning, Arthur had been found by a maintenance crew about 5 miles from the station on a rural road that did not connect to the park property. He was injured severely and incoherent. The official report was that he had attempted to leave the station during a panic attack and had gotten lost and injured in the dark. I asked her what had actually happened. Helen said, "I do not know." Arthur was never able to explain it coherently. He spent 2 months in the hospital, and then he transferred to a different Park Service position. I checked on him years later. He is still employed by the Park Service, but he never worked nights again. He requested and received permanent day shift positions. He never came back here. I asked Helen if she believed that something was actually happening at the station, or if these were just safety rules that had become superstition over time. Helen said, "I believe that every ranger who has worked this night shift has experienced something that they could not explain. I believe that the handprint is not the first impossible thing that has happened here, and I believe that the rules exist because someone figured out a long time ago what behavior keeps people safe." She paused, and then she said, "Michael came to the park in 1994. That was the year these rules were written. Before Michael, there were different rules, or there were no rules, and there was a problem that required different management. When Michael implemented these 6 rules, the incidents stopped. The station became stable." I asked Helen what she thought the rules were actually protecting against. She said, "That is the question I have never been able to answer. Michael will not discuss it. The rangers who stayed long enough to understand something will not discuss it. I can only tell you that these rules appear to be the result of a negotiation between the Park Service and something else that lives in this location. The rules define acceptable behavior. Following them keeps a fragile peace. Breaking them breaks the peace." I told Helen that I had already broken the first rule by answering the radio. I asked if that meant the handprint was the beginning of escalation, or if it was the consequence itself. Helen said, "I do not know, but I would not break any more of them. She stayed until 8 a.m., and then she left me to sleep. I slept for maybe 4 hours. And then I spent the rest of the day thinking about whether I wanted to continue this job. I had a place to live. I had savings. I could probably find work elsewhere. But I also knew that leaving would trigger questions from the Park Service that I did not want to answer. I also knew that my reputation in the community would suffer if I simply quit without explanation after being employed for less than 2 weeks. I decided to stay, but to follow the rules absolutely. No violations, no testing, no exceptions. The second week of night shifts was routine in a way that felt deliberately arranged. No sounds called my name. No strange phenomena occurred. The handprint did not return. Helen's check-ins continued at regular intervals. Nothing happened. The third week was the same. I fell into a rhythm where the night shift became almost meditative. I would monitor the radio, patrol inside the station, read, and wait for dawn. I was developing a schedule where I slept most of the day and worked all night. My contact with the human world was limited to Helen's voice on the radio and the occasional necessary communication with the park office. By the fourth week, I had almost convinced myself that the handprint had been an anomaly, perhaps something that could be explained by animal behavior or water running down the outside of the window and creating a visual effect. This was rationalization, but it was functional rationalization. It allowed me to continue working. Then the fifth week, I discovered something that made me understand why the rules had been created. I was in the station storage area, looking for spare batteries for the flashlights, when I found a box that had been pushed to the back of the lowest shelf. The box was old, labeled with the year 1994, and the name Michael Vance. I opened it carefully. Inside were incident reports from before the 6 rules were implemented. The reports were handwritten, dated from 1993 and early 1994, and they documented a series of escalating incidents at the station. The first incident was simple. A ranger had heard sounds outside the station at night and had investigated. He found footprints in the snow that did not lead to or from anywhere. The footprints simply appeared in the middle of the forest, as if someone had materialized there. The ranger reported it, but had no explanation for it. The second incident involved a ranger discovering that equipment inside the locked station had been moved. Radios were in different locations. Tools had been rearranged. The door and windows remained locked. The ranger concluded that someone had a key, or that someone was able to enter without unlocking anything. A security review found no evidence of unauthorized key duplication. The third incident was more disturbing. A ranger had answered the radio late at night and heard a voice on the other end that sounded exactly like his own voice. The other voice was answering the questions he had asked before he asked them, responding to statements he had not yet made. The ranger had hung up the phone, terrified, and had not answered any radio communications for the rest of that night. The incidents escalated. Rangers reported being called by name from outside the station. Rangers reported seeing their own faces reflected in windows where no one else was present. Rangers reported sounds that seemed to mimic their own voices, their own speech patterns, their own private conversations spoken back to them from the darkness outside. One ranger had attempted to leave the station during the night and reported being unable to find the access road despite knowing exactly where it was. He said the road seemed to be in a different location each time he turned around to find it. He had walked for over an hour, disoriented and terrified, until dawn arrived and he was able to retrace his path back to the station. Another ranger had reported looking out the western window and seeing something standing on the cliff that should not have been able to stand there. The description was vague. The ranger described it as roughly human-shaped, but moving in a way that was wrong, asymmetrical, and unpredictable. The ranger said that looking at it caused a sensation of wrongness in his perception, like his eyes could not quite focus on what he was seeing. By March 1994, the incidents had become constant and severe. Rangers were experiencing psychological distress. Some were calling in sick. Others were requesting transfers. One ranger had attempted to stay awake for an entire night shift and had suffered a mental breakdown, hallucinating voices and images for hours. That ranger had been hospitalized and had subsequently left the Park Service. Michael Vance's response, documented in a letter in the box, had been to implement the 6 rules. The letter explained that Michael believed the incidents were related to how human beings were interacting with something that lived in or near the station. Michael theorized that answering the radio was allowing some kind of communication that was not intended. Staying outside after certain hours was allowing some kind of contact that was similarly unintended. Acknowledging sounds that called the name was, perhaps, acknowledging something that should remain unacknowledged. Responding to one's own reflection, or one's own voice, was perhaps creating a dangerous feedback loop. The rules were designed to minimize interaction, to create a boundary between human behavior and whatever was responding to that behavior. Michael wrote that the goal was to achieve a state where the ranger and the entity, he never named it, never described it, just called it the phenomenon, could coexist without escalation. The plan apparently worked. After the rules were implemented, the incident reports stopped. The rangers who remained on the night shift reported no further phenomena. The Park Service continued to staff the position. The rules became a permanent fixture of the job. I sat in that storage room reading Michael's letter, and I understood what the handprint meant. I had broken the first rule by answering the radio. The handprint was a response to that violation. It was not an attack. It was a reminder that the rules existed for a reason. It was a message that said, "You have broken the agreement. This is what happens when you break the agreement." I put the box back where I had found it. I did not mention it to anyone. I knew that Michael would not want those reports to be known or discussed. I also knew that I would follow the rules now with absolute precision, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The rest of my first 3 months at the station passed with no further incidents. I maintained perfect adherence to the 6 rules. I did not answer the radio after sunset. I stayed indoors between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. I avoided the northern trail after dark. I did not acknowledge sounds that called my name. I kept every interior light on throughout the night. I never looked out the western window. I fell into a pattern of existence that was strange, but manageable. Helen continued her check-ins. She seemed satisfied that I was staying safe. Michael called me once, in person, about 2 months into my employment. He asked how I was doing. I told him that everything was normal, and that I was following the rules. He said, that was good. He also said that if I ever had questions about the station or the procedures, I should consider them answered by the rules themselves. He said, "The rules are not mysterious because we want them to be. They are mysterious because the answer to why we have them is something we cannot explain." Then he hung up. I realized, after that call, that I was going to spend my career working this job and never fully understanding what was actually happening at the station. I was going to tend my post, follow the rules, and maintain the boundary that previous rangers and park administrators had established. I was going to be one of the people who kept this strange arrangement functioning without ever being entirely sure what the arrangement actually protected me from. But then, near the end of my 3rd month, something happened that changed my understanding again. It was a Friday night in late June. The summer season at the park was beginning, and there had been an increased number of visitors. I had been monitoring the radio periodically during the evening hours, though I was still not responding to any after-sunset transmissions. At around 6 p.m., I received a radio call from the main park office asking if there were any outstanding visitors who had not yet exited the park. I logged the message but did not respond, since sunset was at 8:30 p.m. that evening. I decided I would check the call at 7 a.m. and respond to the office if necessary. What I did not anticipate was that a visitor would arrive at the station at 11:15 p.m. I was in the office, all the lights on, following the locked hours protocol of remaining indoors, when I heard a knock on the station door. It was forceful and panicked. A voice outside shouted that someone needed help. I immediately understood that this was a violation of the rules, or at least a complication that the rules had not specifically addressed. The rules said I should stay inside between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., but they did not say what to do if someone was in genuine distress outside. I looked through the north-facing window and saw a man in his 30s, dressed in casual hiking clothes, with an injury to his left leg. He was leaning against the railing on the station porch, clearly in pain. He said again that he needed help. He explained that he had gotten lost on the northern trail while hiking after sunset. Apparently, he had not realized the trail was supposed to close and had fallen on the rocks. His phone had no signal. He had found the station by following the access road. I opened the door and helped him inside. This was the right thing to do. This was the humanitarian thing to do. This was also a violation of the locked hours rule. I helped him to one of the cots and examined his leg. It was badly bruised, and the ankle was probably sprained or fractured. I gave him water and called Helen on the office radio, reporting the situation and requesting medical assistance. Helen said that an ambulance would be dispatched from the main park clinic about 30 minutes away. She said to keep the visitor stable and comfortable. Then she said, very quietly, "How did he get to the station?" I told her that he had gotten lost on the northern trail and had followed the access road to the station. There was a long pause. Helen said, "The northern trail does not connect to the access road. They are approximately 2 miles apart, with no connecting routes." I felt something shift in my understanding of the situation. I looked at the man on the cot. He was real. He had weight and presence and a documented injury. His clothes smelled like forest and sweat. He was drinking the water I had given him, but he had gotten to the station through a route that should not have been possible. I asked him very carefully how he had found the station. He said he had been on the northern trail when he fell. He had realized he was lost and hurt, and he had heard someone calling his name from the forest. He had followed the voice, thinking it was another hiker who could help him. The voice had led him down a path that connected to a road, and he had followed that road until he saw lights. He said he did not know if what he had heard was real or if he was hallucinating due to pain. The ambulance arrived 40 minutes later. I gave the paramedics a brief report of what had happened. I did not mention the impossible route or the voice that had called his name. The paramedics loaded him into the ambulance and transported him to the clinic. After they left, I called Helen back. Helen said that I had done the right thing by helping him. She also said that what had happened was a violation of the arrangement. She said that I had technically broken the rule about staying inside during the locked hours, but that I had done so with justification. She said that the person I had helped was probably not entirely real, or was not entirely there, or existed in a state that was complicated by the situation. I did not understand what Helen meant. I asked her to explain. She said, the voice that called his name was coming from the station, or it was coming from something that lives here and uses the station as a focal point. By answering that call, by helping him, you have allowed it to guide someone directly to the station, in violation of the boundary the rules create. The man you helped may have gotten lost on the northern trail a month ago, or a year ago, and he may have been wandering in the forest the entire time, being guided by that voice toward the station, or he may have arrived just now, through a route that only exists in a way that we cannot perceive. I do not know, but I know that bringing him inside has changed something. I asked Helen if there would be consequences. She said she did not know. She said that the situation was unpredictable now. She said I had acted correctly according to human ethics and medical protocol, but I had acted incorrectly according to the rules that kept the station stable. She said Michael would need to be informed and that I should document the incident with complete precision. Michael called me at 4 in the morning. He said he had spoken to Helen and that he had reviewed my incident report. He said that I had made a reasonable decision under difficult circumstances, but that the decision had created a complication. He asked me if I had noticed anything unusual about the man's description of how he had gotten to the station. I told him what the man had reported. Michael was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "The Northern Trail has been closed after sunset for more than 20 years. Before that, there were visitor incidents that required the closure. Visitors were becoming lost in the evening and spending the night on the trail. They were reporting disorientation, encountering themselves in some way, becoming unable to retrace their steps. The closure was supposed to prevent those incidents. Your visitor should not have been able to hike that trail at all." I asked if the man I had helped was actually a visitor, or if he was something else. Michael said, "I do not know. We may never know. The question is whether he will come back to the station or whether the arrangement will remain intact now that it has been violated." He told me to continue following the rules. He told me to report any unusual incidents immediately. He told me that he would be monitoring the situation closely. Then he ended the call. I did not sleep that morning. I sat in the station office with all the lights on and waited for dawn. Nothing else happened that night. The following day, I called the park clinic to check on the visitor's status. The clinic said he had been released early that morning with a diagnosis of a minor ankle sprain. He had declined to file an incident report. He had accepted a ride back to the trailhead parking area and had apparently driven away. There was no way to contact him for follow-up because he had not provided emergency contact information or a forwarding address. Helen's explanation was that the man was probably never really injured, or that his injury was something that existed in a way that did not match normal physical reality. She said that his presence at the station had been a message or a test, and that I had passed by helping him. She said that the arrangement might not be as fragile as we had thought. The rest of the summer passed without incident. Visitors continued to come and go from the park. No more unexpected arrivals at the station during the locked hours. The sounds that had called my name at the beginning of my employment never returned. I began to wonder if the initial phenomena were simply an initiation, a way of testing whether the new ranger would follow the rules or whether they would need to be taught the consequences of violation. By September, I had settled into the job completely. The strangeness had become routine. The rules had become simply part of my work procedures, as unremarkable as checking the generator or logging equipment maintenance. Helen continued her check-ins, but they became more conversational. We would sometimes talk about things other than the station operations. She mentioned that she had a family, that she liked gardening, that she was considering retiring in the next few years. The station became less terrifying and more simply lonely. In October, Michael called me again. He said that he had decided to make a change to the night shift procedures. He said that, effective immediately, I would no longer work alone. A second ranger would be assigned to share the night shifts with me. He said that this decision had been made to improve staff morale and to ensure better coverage of the station. He said that the second ranger had been briefed on the operational procedures and that they would be starting the following week. I was relieved to hear this. I had grown tired of the isolation, and the company would probably make the nights feel less heavy. The second ranger was a woman named Sarah, who was in her mid-40s and who had worked day shifts for the park for over a decade. She was experienced, professional, and took the job seriously. Michael met with both of us and reviewed the 6 rules. Sarah listened without question or comment. She agreed to follow the procedures. She was assigned to work Sunday through Thursday nights, and I would work Monday through Friday nights, with Friday and Saturday nights covered by both of us. The addition of a second ranger changed the dynamic of the station, but not in the way I expected. With someone else present, the night shifts became more bearable, but they also became more complicated. Sarah was observant and intelligent, and after a few weeks of working together, she asked me directly what was actually happening at the station. She said that the rules did not make sense unless there was something specific they were protecting against, and she wanted to know what that something was. I told her what I knew, which was the abbreviated version. I told her about the handprint, about the incident reports from 1993, about the visitor who had arrived through an impossible route. I did not tell her about the sounds that had called my name, because I was not sure if that was something that happened to every new ranger, or if it had been specific to me and my violation of the radio rule. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said that she had worked at the park for a long time, and that she had suspected something was happening at the station, but that nobody would ever explain it clearly. She said that she had the last few years of her career ahead of her, and that she did not want to spend them in ignorance. She asked me if I would help her gather more information. I told her that I did not think that was a good idea, that the rules existed for a reason, and that violating them had consequences. She said that observing did not necessarily constitute violating. She said that if we were careful and strategic, we might be able to understand what was actually happening without crossing the line into danger. I should have said no. I should have told her that my job was to follow the rules and to maintain the arrangement, not to investigate the arrangement. But I also understood her desire to know. I had felt the same desire when I had first discovered those incident reports. I said that I would help her, but only if we were very careful, and only if we did not allow any investigation to interfere with our strict adherence to the 6 rules. Sarah and I began a careful process of observation. We documented the electromagnetic readings in different parts of the station. We monitored the radio frequencies for patterns or anomalies. We kept detailed notes of temperatures, humidity, and ambient sounds during the night hours. We did not go anywhere we were not supposed to go. We did not do anything that violated the rules. We simply paid careful attention to what was happening around us and tried to identify patterns. What we discovered over the course of several months of observation was that the station was not random or chaotic. There were regular patterns of activity. The sounds that seemed to come from outside appeared at specific times. The temperature in different areas of the station fluctuated on a schedule that did not correlate with weather patterns. The equipment in the station showed subtle signs of being moved or adjusted between night shifts, despite the fact that we were both present and would have noticed any actual movement. There was an intelligence of some kind operating within or adjacent to the station. That intelligence was not hostile. It was not particularly interested in us. It existed in a state of coexistence with the human operation of the station, and as long as we followed the rules, it tolerated our presence. Then Sarah violated the 3rd rule. It happened on a night in December when we were both working. A late visitor had been reported in the Northern Trail section at dusk. The visitor had not returned to the parking area by closing time. Standard protocol would be to contact the visitor by radio and ask them to exit the trail, but the radio rule prevented any after-sunset communication. The usual procedure, according to Helen, was to note the visitor position and contact them the next morning if they had not returned. Sarah decided that the visitor might be injured or lost, and that we should conduct an evening patrol of the Northern Trail to check on them. The trail itself was not prohibited. It was only prohibited after dark. Dusk existed in a gray area, not entirely dark, but past sunset. Sarah made the decision to go, and I did not stop her, which was my mistake. I should have insisted that we follow the rules exactly. Instead, I followed her onto the Northern Trail at 6:45 p.m., about 90 minutes after sunset, but while there was still some ambient light in the sky. The trail appeared normal at first. It was well maintained and clearly marked. Sarah and I walked with our flashlights, looking for any sign of the late visitor. But after we had walked for about a mile, which would have taken us roughly into the middle section of the trail, something changed. The trail became disoriented. I cannot describe it more accurately than that. We were clearly on a path, clearly walking forward with a purpose, but our spatial awareness became unreliable. The forest around us seemed to rotate or shift, so that we could not reliably determine which direction we had come from. Sarah stopped walking and looked at me. She said, "This is not normal. I know this trail. This is not the way it should feel." We turned around to head back toward the station, or at least toward what we thought was the direction of the station. But the path we were on did not cooperate. Each time we tried to walk in a specific direction, the trail would seem to curve or branch in a way that redirected us. Sarah used her GPS unit to try to navigate, but the device was not locking to a satellite signal. The compass I had brought was spinning erratically, unable to determine north. After what felt like 30 minutes of walking, though it might have been less, we came upon a clearing in the forest. In the clearing, there was a person sitting on a rock. The person had their back to us. The person was shaped like a human and had human hair, but there was something fundamentally wrong about how they were sitting, the angles of their posture, the way they were holding their head. Sarah grabbed my arm and stopped walking. She whispered, "Do not look at their face." I did not look at their face. I pulled Sarah away from the clearing, and we walked quickly in what we hoped was a different direction. After another few minutes of walking through the forest, we burst out onto a road that I did not recognize. The road did not match any of the park's mapped access routes. Sarah and I stood there, trying to orient ourselves, when we saw lights approaching from down the road. A Park Service vehicle pulled up, and Helen emerged from the driver's side. Helen said, without preamble, "Get in the vehicle." We got in. Helen drove for approximately 10 minutes on that unknown road, and then turned onto a route I recognized, the access road back to the station. She drove us back to the station, came inside, and then she sat us both down and explained what had happened. She said that the Northern Trail section after dark is not actually on the park property in a way that we could reliably perceive. She said that accessing it after sunset takes the person into a different spatial relationship, a place where human geography does not apply. She said that the arrangement at the station depends on a boundary between the human space of the station and the non-human space surrounding it. The Northern Trail is the most permeable part of that boundary, the place where the two spaces come closest to overlapping. She said that the rules exist because that overlap is dangerous. Visiting the Northern Trail after dark is explicitly prohibited because the trail leads somewhere that should not be entered. Acknowledging sounds that call your name is prohibited because those sounds originate from the non-human side of the boundary, and recognizing them creates a connection across the boundary that can be exploited. Not looking out the western window is prohibited because the western window faces directly at the place where the boundary is thinnest. Helen said that we had been extremely fortunate. The person in the clearing had probably been something that existed on the other side of the boundary, something that was curious about us, but willing to tolerate our presence as long as we respected the rules. We had left the area before any direct contact occurred. Helen had been monitoring our position through the station's equipment and had driven to retrieve us. I asked Helen how she had known where we were. She said that the station has equipment that tracks the location of anyone who has violated the established protocol. The equipment creates a signal that can be followed. She said this system had been installed in 1994 specifically to prevent rangers from becoming lost in the same way that the visitor in June had become lost. Sarah was terrified. She asked if going to the Northern Trail after sunset had broken the arrangement. Helen said she did not know. She said that Michael would need to make that determination. She said that, in the meantime, Sarah should continue working as normal and follow the rules absolutely. She said that any further violations would result in immediate termination and possibly something worse. Michael called me the next morning. He said that Sarah had violated the third rule and that he was considering his options. He said that the arrangement was fragile, and that repeated violations by different rangers suggested either that the rules needed to be restated more clearly, or that the position required a different caliber of ranger. He said that I had not actually violated the rule because I had been attempting to ensure the safety of a visitor, but that I had exercised poor judgment by following Sarah onto the trail. He said that Sarah would be given one more chance. If she violated any of the rules again, her employment would be terminated immediately. He said that I needed to be the senior ranger on the night shifts, and it was my responsibility to ensure that Sarah understood the seriousness of the rules and the reason for them. I had a difficult conversation with Sarah the next night. I explained everything I had learned about the station and the arrangement. I told her that the rules were not arbitrary and that violating them had consequences that were not limited to professional discipline. I told her that we had been lucky to escape the Northern Trail unharmed, and that luck was not something we should rely on. Sarah listened, and I think she understood. She did not violate any rules again. Over time, she became as committed to following the procedures as I was. I have now worked night shifts at Appalachian Ridge Station for almost 3 years. Sarah and I continue to work together, maintaining the routine and following the 6 rules without exception. We have both had many opportunities to break those rules, to test their necessity, to investigate the boundaries of the arrangement. We have chosen not to. We have learned that the purpose of the rules is not to punish us or to burden us. The purpose is to maintain a coexistence with something that exists in the same physical space, but in a different perceptual reality. Nothing dramatic happens at the station most nights. The radio functions normally. The building remains secure. The lights stay on. We stay inside during the locked hours. We do our job quietly and professionally. The station operates as it has for nearly 30 years, serving a function that most visitors to the park never understand. But on certain nights, usually during the fall or spring when the boundary between seasons creates a kind of permeability in the air, something acknowledges our presence. It is not malevolent. It is not even particularly interested in us. But it is aware that we are here, that we are following the rules, that we are maintaining the arrangement. I do not know what the arrangement actually is. I do not know what entity or intelligence exists on the other side of the western window, in the Northern Trail section after dark, in the spaces between human perception. I do not need to know. My job is simply to follow the 6 rules and to ensure that other rangers do the same. If you work in remote locations, if you have been given rules that do not seem to have a rational explanation, if you have experienced phenomena that suggests a boundary exists between your world and something else, then you already understand what I am trying to communicate. You already know that some locations require a different kind of relationship between human beings and the space we occupy. You already understand that the official explanations will never satisfy your need to know what is actually happening. The 6 rules are still in effect at Appalachian Ridge Station. New rangers continue to be hired and continue to be briefed on the procedures. Most rangers follow the rules without question. Some rangers ask for transfers or resign after a few weeks. A very few rangers begin to understand that the rules are not restrictions, but rather a contract, a way of living peacefully, alongside something that will never be fully explained. I still work night shifts in Appalachia. I still follow every single rule without exception. I still keep all the lights on, stay inside during the locked hours, never look out the western window. I still do not answer the radio after sunset. Though the calls have become less frequent over time, I still do not acknowledge the sounds that call my name. Though those sounds have changed in character, they sound less like they are trying to lure me and more like they are simply checking to ensure I am still following the agreement. And I am grateful, on every night shift, that whatever exists in this place has decided that following the rules is sufficient payment for the privilege of working here. because if the arrangement ever breaks, if the boundary ever collapses, if the rules are ever no longer effective at maintaining the coexistence we have established, I do not know what will happen to the ranger who has to face that consequence. But until that day comes, I will keep the lights on and follow the 6 rules, and I will sleep during the day knowing that the night shift is at least predictable, at least manageable, as long as everyone remembers that the rules are not there for us. They are there for something else. I still work avalanche rescue in the San Juan Range, but I do not go back to Maroon Basin. The avalanche there stopped moving 3 years ago. We knew it should have released. When we finally dug down to find out why, we found something that did not belong in snow. If stories like this are why you listen when you should be sleeping, subscribe and share this with someone you trust enough to tell the things that nobody will believe. If you want to hear the full case files from avalanche rangers who saw things in the backcountry that changed what they thought was possible, join the channel for member-only recordings of rescue missions that were never officially documented. My name is Dale, and I have been working avalanche rescue in southwestern Colorado for 17 years. That matters because I need you to understand that I know what snow does. I know how it moves, why it fails, how it breaks, what it sounds like when it lets go at 4 in the morning with no wind and no new weather. I know the difference between stable pack and dangerous slopes. I have taught rescue fundamentals to seasonal volunteers. I have testified in depositions about why certain paths are impassable and others are safe. So when I tell you that what happened in November of 2019 violated every principle I had learned about how avalanche terrain behaves, I need that credibility to matter. Maroon Basin sits at the northern edge of the Pyramid Peak Range, accessible only through a 2-mile approach on foot. The basin fills with snow early because of the surrounding ridgelines, and it clears late because of the northern exposure. Most years, we put Maroon Basin on secondary watch status for only 4 weeks during spring load. Then it settles. The snow bonds with the base layers. The danger passes. By late autumn, it is considered stable ground. November 2019 had brought unusually heavy early snow. We had received 2 weather systems in succession, and the snowpack in the high country was running about 40% above normal for the date. Most routes above 11,000 feet were off limits, until we could properly assess the bonding and ensure structural integrity. But Maroon Basin was supposed to be stable. We had clear skies for 3 days. We had done the preliminary forecasting and posted the green flag for monitored access. The call came in around 3 in the afternoon on November 18th. A group of 5 ice climbers had filed their trip permit for the Maroon Basin approach. They had been expected back at the trailhead parking by 6 that evening. By 8 o'clock, they had not checked in. Family members called the ranger station. The ranger on duty, a man named Marcus, who had been with the service for 9 seasons, immediately filed the SAR alert and called in the rescue team. I was at the ranger station finishing field reports when Marcus got the call. He turned to me and said, "Maroon Basin, late check-in on the climbers." I remember that because it was strange wording. He did not say they were overdue. He said, "late check-in," like the phrase tasted wrong in his mouth. I asked him about the weather report, about whether there had been new precipitation, about whether the climbing party had experience with the slope angles. He told me the forecast was stable, the conditions were supposed to be solid, and the climbing group was experienced. But his jaw was tight. Within an hour, we had 12 people staged at the Maroon Basin trailhead. The sun was going down. We had maybe 30 minutes of useful daylight left. We assembled the rescue kit: probe poles, shovels, rope, beacon packs, communication equipment, and the secondary oxygen bottles, and began the approach. The snow beneath our feet was dense and well packed. The route was clear, no visible evidence of instability. No obvious crack lines or settling sounds. Nothing that would suggest the terrain was anything other than what we had forecasted. We were about a mile up the approach when Marcus raised his hand and stopped the team. He was looking upslope toward the eastern ridgeline. I remember asking him what he saw. He said, "Nothing." That is the problem. What he meant became clear after another minute. The snow in the upper basin was wrong. There was a depression line running from the northwest corner all the way across to the eastern exposure. It looked like something had poured downslope and then stopped. The margins were clean, almost surgical. The disruption covered roughly a quarter of the basin floor, but it did not look like an avalanche. Avalanche paths are violent. They create disorder. They leave tangled trees, scattered boulders, a chaotic record of descent. This looked like something had moved through the snow and then held itself in place, leaving an exact record of its passage. Marcus called it in to base camp. The response came back almost immediately. Hold position and await assignment from the incident commander. We waited. The sun dropped below the ridgeline. We switched on the headlamps and kept waiting. The incident commander was another ranger named Chris Volk, someone with 23 years of rescue experience. Chris responded that we should proceed carefully to the edge of the disruption line and attempt visual contact with the climbing party. We moved in a line, maintaining distance intervals and using probe poles to test the stability beneath every step. The snow did not feel dangerous. It felt normal. The worry I had felt in my chest as we moved upslope began to ease. Maybe there had been a minor settlement. Maybe the disruption was from natural wind loading or slope movement, something normal and explicable that just happened to look unusual in the darkness. We were close to convincing ourselves when we found the first body. She was about 20 meters from the disruption line, laid out on her back in the snow with her arms at her sides. No trauma, no visible injury, no blood. She was wearing full winter climbing gear, and her eyes were open, frozen mid-stare into the black sky. Marcus knelt beside her and checked for pulse. We all already knew there would not be one. She had been out there long enough for the cold to have finished its work. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the order matters. We called it in. Chris directed us to mark the body and proceed with extreme caution to locate the other four. We marked the location with a snow stake and a flag. I documented the exact position on our GPS unit. The coordinates went into the incident log. Then we moved forward. The second body was inside the disruption line. She was partially submerged in the snow, maybe 30 centimeters down from the surface. We found her because Marcus's probe pole went through empty space and sank much deeper than it should have. We began digging carefully with the small shovels, creating a recovery pit around her position. The snow here was different. It was softer, almost granular. It broke apart rather than compacted. As we dug, I realized that the snow we were removing had never been properly bonded with the surrounding pack. It had the texture of freshly fallen powder, even though the snow had supposedly been settling for 3 days under stable conditions. The second woman was still in her climbing harness. There was a rope attached, climbing toward the upper slope. We followed the rope and found the third body about 40 meters upslope, still harnessed, still connected to the same line. This one showed injury, a fracture to the left arm, and the climbing harness was twisted in a way that suggested rapid descent or sudden stop. The expression on the frozen face was different from the first body. This was not peaceful. This was confusion. This was fear. We were running out of time and daylight efficiency. Chris radioed that a second rescue team was now an hour from the basin. He told us to focus on securing the scene and recovering the remaining 2 climbers. We found them within the next 10 minutes, both inside the disruption line, both already deceased, both showing signs of having struggled against something. But what struck me, what has stayed with me for 3 years now, was what we found embedded in the snow among the climbing gear. There was a radio. Not the climbing party's radio. Not something we had brought. A radio that nobody on that rescue team had any explanation for. It was a handheld unit, old style, Motorola or something, from that generation. It was partially melted. It was buried maybe 15 centimeters into the snowbed, resting at an angle that suggested it had been placed there deliberately, not dropped during a fall. I picked it up because nobody explicitly told me not to. Marcus asked me what I had found, and I told him. He took it from me and examined it. Then he did something I will never forget. He looked directly at me and said, "We do not have a radio in the equipment logs. We never found a radio. You understand that, right? This never happened here. This is not part of the incident report." I understood what he was saying. I also understood why he was saying it. A handheld radio at that position, at that depth, at that angle, suggested things that did not fit any simple explanation. It suggested premeditation. It suggested purpose. It suggested that someone had known the climbing party was going to die on that slope and had marked the location before it happened. Marcus placed the radio in his jacket pocket. No words were exchanged. When the second rescue team arrived and the full documentation of the scene began, the radio was not mentioned. There was no photograph of the radio. There was no entry in the incident report. The 5 climbing fatalities were attributed to an avalanche. The official cause was listed as unstable slope with structural failure under load. The bodies were recovered and transported to the coroner's office in Montrose. The families were notified. The climbing permits were reviewed. The conclusions were drawn. But that radio existed. I held it. 3 weeks after the recovery, Marcus called me at home. He said, "The snow in Maroon Basin has not moved since we left. It is still there. The basin has not had any new precipitation. The temperature has not climbed above freezing. By every scientific measure, that slope should have stabilized long ago. It has not. It is still waiting. And it is waiting in exactly the same position it was when we found the bodies." I told him that seemed impossible. He said, "That is why you cannot mention it." Over the following months, Chris Volk and I talked several times. He confirmed what Marcus had told me. The Maroon Basin slope had entered a state of suspended stability. It had not released again, but it had not stabilized either. Snow does not do that. It either holds or it does not. It either breaks or it settles. Maroon Basin was doing something else. It was waiting. And when, in the early spring of 2020, a small team of rangers went back to collect weather data and take updated slope measurements, they found something else embedded in the snow. Another radio. Same model. Partially melted. Buried at a precise depth that reflected exactly how far the snow had settled since the bodies were recovered. That one was photographed. I have seen the photograph. It exists in a ranger database that is not open to public records requests, in a file folder that is marked with restricted access codes, attached to an incident summary that mentions anomalous objects and unexplained placement. 2 radios in the same location, placed by someone or something that could predict how much snow would settle, exactly where the climbing party would die, and how deep to bury the markers to make them discovered at exactly the right time for it to matter. The basin was officially closed in March of 2020. A perimeter was posted. No climbing parties are permitted. No research teams are granted access. When other rangers ask why the route is closed, they are told that a large avalanche is expected. But there was no large avalanche. There is only an open slope waiting for nothing in particular. I stopped going to that basin after the second radio was found. I told Chris I did not want rotation assignments there. He understood. Marcus took early retirement in 2021. I saw him once at a coffee shop in Ridgeway, and I did not approach him. Some things are better left unacknowledged. I tell that story now because someone needs to know what I know. Because the official record will never include the truth. Because there are people, rescue workers, rangers, people whose job it is to understand the mountains who have carried this information silently for years. There is also a second incident that I think about when I am driving home after a long shift in the high country. The second story comes from a ranger named Sarah, who worked avalanche mitigation in the Needle Mountains Division. Sarah and I have never met in person, but we have communicated through a private forum that rescue rangers use to discuss incidents that do not make it into official reports. She agreed to let me relay her account. Sarah had been working for the Forest Service for 8 years when she was assigned to an active mitigation project on Crestone Peak in the fall of 2017. The project was straightforward: install pressure sensors along the northern couloir, which had produced several large avalanches in recent years, and use the data to optimize the timing of controlled explosions designed to prevent larger uncontrolled release. The sensors were placed at intervals of roughly 50 meters down the slope, each one equipped with a small transmitter that reported pressure readings every 15 minutes to a base station housed in a small structure at the 9,000-foot level. The base station was small, roughly the size of a telephone booth, and it was where Sarah and the other technicians spent most of their time during winter and early spring, monitoring the readouts and maintaining the equipment. The project had been running successfully for 2 seasons. The data was reliable. The explosions were timed effectively. The mitigation was working as intended. But in late September, something changed. The first anomaly was small. One of the pressure sensors, the one at the highest elevation, began to report readings that were inconsistent with the others. It was showing spikes of pressure followed by sudden drops, in a pattern that did not match the typical compaction curve of settling snow or the slow increase that came with new precipitation. Sarah reviewed the data and suspected a sensor malfunction. She reported it to her supervisor and filed a work order to have the sensor replaced. The replacement took 2 weeks to schedule. When Sarah and a technician named David went up to the highest sensor location to install the new unit, they found something unexpected. The old sensor was still functioning. The wire connecting it to the transmitter had been carefully severed, probably with a knife or sharp tool. And below the severed sensor, in the snow about 15 centimeters down, was a second transmitter. Not one of theirs. A completely unknown device, smaller than the standard mitigation equipment, but clearly a pressure sensor of some kind. David suggested that maybe it was old equipment from a research project, perhaps a university study, that had been conducted before the mitigation team took over the couloir. Sarah called the supervisor and reported what they had found. The supervisor told her to remove the unknown device and not include it in the official incident report. Sarah complied. She removed the device and brought it down the mountain. Then she did something that most people would not do. She took it to a graduate student at Colorado State University who worked with sensor technology. The graduate student, who agreed to speak with me on the condition that I not use his name, examined the device and told Sarah something that changed the nature of the problem. The device was a pressure sensor, but it was not measuring snow pressure. It was measuring something below the snow. Whatever it was registering was creating localized pressure variations at distinct intervals, almost like something was moving beneath the snowpack. Sarah did not know what to do with that information. She knew it did not make sense. She knew it suggested something impossible. She also knew that her supervisor had explicitly told her not to report it officially. So she did what people do when they encounter something that violates their understanding of reality. She tried to ignore it. She moved on with the mitigation project. She tried to think of rational explanations for a pressure sensor that was measuring something moving under the snow. But then, the main sensor array began reporting anomalies too. It started with the sensor at the 8,000-foot level. It reported a sustained pressure increase that should not have been possible. New snow had not fallen. There had been no temperature change. The existing snowpack should not have been compacting on its own. And yet the pressure reading climbed steadily over the course of 4 days, increasing by almost a third of its previous baseline. Sarah flagged it as a potential equipment malfunction and scheduled a sensor check. When David went up to inspect the sensor, he reported back that the equipment looked fine. The connections were secure. The sensor itself showed no visible damage. But when he tried to remove it from the snow, he found that it had been deliberately buried deeper than the installation depth. Someone had dug down around it and packed the snow more densely. Whoever had done this had done it carefully, without damaging the sensor itself. They had simply repositioned it to be deeper in the snowpack, which would change how it reported pressure. David brought down a soil sample from around the sensor location, thinking that maybe there had been a human crew working on the slope without authorization. Sarah took the sample to the geology department at Colorado State and had it analyzed. The soil contained no anomalies, but it did contain tracks. Or rather, it had contained tracks before they were covered by snow. The analyst showed her photographs of impressions in the soil that looked like footprints, but the spacing and depth suggested something very heavy and very deliberate in how it moved. Sarah did not report this to her supervisor. She realized by now that reporting these things would not result in official investigation. It would result in the information being suppressed. So she kept monitoring the sensors herself, pulling the raw data files and examining them in her own time. What she found, over the course of the next 2 months, was a pattern. The pressure readings in the sensor array were moving. Not moving upslope or downslope, but moving side to side, in a deliberate pattern that covered the width of the couloir. It was as if something was walking along a path beneath the snowpack, moving back and forth like it was following something or searching for something. The thing was heavy enough to create measurable pressure changes in the snow. It was intelligent enough to understand how the sensor array worked and how to disable or reposition individual units without destroying them completely. And then, in late October, Sarah noticed something even more disturbing. The pattern of movement had changed. It was no longer moving side to side. It was moving upslope. It was moving toward the base station where she and David spent their working days. Sarah made a decision. She requested a transfer to a different mitigation project in a different range, working with a different sensor array. She did not give a reason. She did not file any formal report. She just asked to be moved. Her supervisor approved the transfer immediately, which told Sarah that he knew something was wrong and was relieved to have her off that particular project. Before she left, Sarah deleted all the anomalous data from the project files. She did not want her successor to find evidence of something that could not be explained. She wanted the sensor array to look like it was functioning normally. She also removed the copies of the data that she had saved to her personal files and destroyed them. She has not worked on the Needle Mountains division since. The Crestone Peak Mitigation Project continues to this day. The pressure sensors continue to report data. As far as the official record is concerned, everything is operating normally. But Sarah told me that in 2019, almost 2 years after she left the project, she ran into David at a ranger conference. David had stayed with the mitigation team. David looked at her with a specific kind of recognition and said, "It never left. It is still there. The pressure readings now move downslope in the morning and upslope at dusk, like it is hunting with the sun." Sarah did not respond. She did not follow up. She did not ask David if he had reported what he was seeing. She simply tried to forget that she had ever worked on that mountain. She successfully transferred to a desk position in 2020 and has not returned to active fieldwork since. She joined the Ranger Forum and shared this account because she believed that people like me, people who work in active rescue and mitigation, needed to understand that there are things in the backcountry that defy the standard frameworks we use to interpret danger. Something was beneath that snow. Something was intelligent, something was hunting, and the official response was to allow it to continue unacknowledged and unmonitored. The third incident is the one I have never told anyone except the other rangers who were present. I have never spoken about it in any formal setting. I have never filed a report. I have never even written it down in my personal notes. What I am about to tell you is something that only exists in the memories of 3 men and 1 woman who made an unspoken agreement never to speak of it officially. This happened in March of 2018. I was on a rescue team led by Chris Volk, the same ranger who coordinated the Maroon Basin recovery. We were staging a controlled mitigation blast on an eastern slope of Peak 17, a location where several small avalanches had created dangerous loading for a critical pass that the Forest Service periodically maintained. Controlled demolition requires precise timing and careful execution. We had placed charges at specific intervals along the slope where we wanted to trigger a controlled release. We had calculated the blast sequence to allow each explosion to move the snow without creating uncontrolled cascade. The plan was to fire the charges remotely from a safe distance, observe the results, and mark the zone as clean. Chris, myself, 2 technicians, named James and Margaret, and 1 external observer were positioned at the safe distance, roughly 300 meters downslope from the intended blast zone. We had radios. We had clear sight lines to the charges. The weather was clear. The timing was right. Chris gave the order to proceed. I want to be absolutely clear about what we saw. The first charge detonated correctly. It created a precise release in the snowpack, just as designed. The snow broke loose and began to move downslope in a controlled manner. But the second charge did not detonate. When an explosive charge fails to detonate, you have specific protocols. You wait 15 minutes. You confirm that the remote signal was not interrupted by radio interference or equipment malfunction. You then attempt a second remote signal. If that fails, you wait another 15 minutes and do not reattempt. The charge is logged as a failed detonation, and a new charge is placed later when the slope has stabilized. Chris initiated the protocol. He waited. He signaled Margaret to check our radio equipment. Margaret confirmed that the equipment was functioning normally and that the signal had been transmitted. Chris waited the required 15 minutes and attempted a second signal. Nothing. The charge did not detonate. That was when James's radio started picking up a transmission. Not our transmission, not one of our team members. A completely different radio signal, using a frequency that was not standard for our mitigation work. It was a brief transmission, just a few seconds, but it was unmistakably a voice, and it was unmistakably responding to something. Chris asked what that was. None of us had any explanation. We checked our radio frequencies, our backup equipment, our communication logs. There was no one else on that mountain. There was no authorized research project. There was no reason for anyone to be transmitting on that frequency. Then the second charge detonated. Not on Chris's signal, not remotely. It simply detonated on its own, roughly 30 seconds after we heard the unknown radio transmission. The detonation was catastrophic. It did not create the controlled release we had planned. It created an immediate and massive uncontrolled avalanche. Snow began cascading down the slope, far more violently than anything we had anticipated. We were positioned to be safe from a controlled release. But we were not positioned to be safe from this. Chris yelled at us to move. We ran downslope, trying to put more distance between ourselves and the moving wall of snow. The avalanche was gaining speed. I could feel the percussion of it behind me, the way the ground was shaking. I could hear the roaring sound as it gathered more snow and more momentum. I could feel the edge of it getting closer. James went down. I saw him stumble, just a momentary loss of footing, and he went down hard. He did not get back up. I did not think. I turned and ran back upslope toward where he was, toward an oncoming avalanche. Margaret was ahead of me, still running. Chris was yelling something I could not hear over the sound of the moving snow. I grabbed James and pulled him up. His ankle was clearly injured, badly injured, but he could hobble. We ran together, moving at a pace that was too slow. The avalanche was close enough that I could feel the wind pressure it was creating, feel the cold air it was displacing. And then, the snow hit us. I have been in avalanches before. I have survived. I know how the snow moves, how it fills the spaces around you, how it tries to bury you and then holds you in its grasp. This was different. This snow did not behave the way snow behaves. It was moving beneath us and around us, but it was not carrying us downslope. It was moving us to the side, laterally, as if something beneath the snow was deliberately steering us away from something else. I was in the snow for maybe 5 or 6 seconds before we broke through the edge. It felt longer. I came up gasping and covered in powder, and James was beside me, coughing and struggling for breath. The avalanche continued around us. The center of its path moved slightly to the north, away from where we were. The snow continued to move, but it left us at the edge, left us alive. Margaret and Chris were alive. Our observer was alive. The avalanche had not killed any of us, despite every reasonable expectation that at least one person would be gone. We stayed upslope, in the settling snow, for several minutes. None of us said anything. I could hear James breathing hard beside me, and the sound of the avalanche slowly coming to a stop. Chris, when he finally spoke, said, "Did anyone else feel that?" We all knew what he meant. We had all felt it. Something had redirected that avalanche. Something beneath or within the snow had made a deliberate choice to change its path and save our lives. Margaret was the one who said what we were all thinking. Something pushed us. And then, so quietly that I almost missed it, Chris said, "Or something stopped us falling." We did not discuss it further. We did not file a report about the sensation of being moved by invisible force. We did not mention the unexplained radio transmission or the charge that detonated on its own. We reported that a controlled charge had malfunctioned and created an uncontrolled avalanche, that we had taken defensive positions, that all team members had survived and would be returning to the station. 3 weeks later, Chris called me and James individually. He told us that the external observer had filed a report mentioning the unexplained radio transmission and the way the avalanche had inexplicably altered its path. Chris said that he had filed a counter-report explaining that observers who had never worked avalanche mitigation often misinterpreted slope behavior under stress. He said that the report was going to be dismissed as observer error, and that was how we were going to leave it. I asked Chris what the observer had actually seen. He said, "The same thing we saw, but the observer did not live with it every day like we do. The observer did not have to think about the mountains the way we think about them. So the observer reported it as paranormal, and I reported it as misinterpretation, and now none of it is true anymore." James died in 2021 in a car accident on a highway outside Silverton. That was 5 years after the avalanche. I attended his funeral. I did not speak to Chris about James's death, and Chris did not bring it up. Margaret still works for the Forest Service. She is in the office in Denver now, in an administrative role. I have not spoken to her since the incident. I still work in the high country. I still handle rescue calls. I still train new rangers and teach them how to read slope conditions and predict instability. I teach them the science. I teach them the procedures. I do not teach them the other things, the things that do not fit into the framework. But I watch the slopes now in a different way than I used to. I notice when an avalanche path is not behaving according to the models. I notice when the snow moves in ways that suggest intention rather than gravity. I notice when there are strange silences in the backcountry, the kind of silence that comes before something happens, and I have learned to respect it. I have learned to assume that the mountains are not the dead, passive system I was trained to believe they are. I have learned that something is alive in those slopes, something that is aware, something that makes choices about what lives and what dies. I tell these stories now because I believe the truth is more important than official records. Because the rangers who come after us deserve to understand that their job is more complicated than the textbooks suggest. because there is something in the high country of Colorado that has made contact with human beings repeatedly across multiple seasons and multiple locations, and nobody is telling the truth about it. It is not malevolent. If it were purely malevolent, we would all be dead. Maroon Basin killed 5 people, yes, but it gave us a warning first. Sarah's mountain showed her what it was doing before it made any aggressive moves. The avalanche, on Peak 17, actively saved our lives. It could have killed us all. It chose not to. But it is also not benevolent. It is something else. It is something that exists in the spaces between the snow and the rock. Something that understands the mountains in a way that we cannot. Something that makes its own choices about human presence in its territory. I still go to work. I still respond to rescue calls. I still examine slopes and analyze conditions. I still do what the training taught me to do. But I do it now with the understanding that I am not actually working alone. Something else is there. It is watching the same snow that I am watching. It is monitoring the same slopes. It is aware of what I am doing. And sometimes, when I am alone on a slope, and I hear something that sounds almost like a radio transmission distant, filtered through static, coming from no identifiable source, I understand that something is checking on me. Something knows my name. Something knows the slopes I work and the routes I take and the times I am most likely to be at certain elevations. I have stopped trying to explain it. I have stopped trying to fit it into the logical framework that my training provided. I have simply learned to listen. And to be grateful on the nights when I make it back down the mountain safely, that whatever shares the high country with me has decided, for one more day, that I am not a threat. If you work in the mountains, if you have felt something watching you from places where nothing should be alive, if you have experienced behavior in the wilderness that your training cannot explain, then you already know what I am talking about. You already understand that the official records do not contain the truth. You already know why rangers make certain decisions without explaining them, why certain routes are avoided without being officially closed, why some stories are passed between workers in quiet conversations and never included in reports. The mountains are not empty. They have never been empty. We just built our careers and our institutions on the assumption that the only intelligence in the high country was our own. We were wrong, and now we are learning to work quietly alongside something else, something that predates our presence and will outlast our understanding. I still work avalanche rescue in the San Juan Range. I will probably work here until I retire, and every season, every snow cycle, every call that takes me back to the slopes, I am carrying with me the knowledge that I am not alone there, that there is something aware, that there is a choice being made every moment I am in those mountains to let me come back alive. And I am grateful for that choice, even though I will never fully understand it. The drill came back up with organic material in the sample chamber. Not sediment, not minerals, not anything that should have existed 9,000 feet below the permafrost in the Beaufort Sea. The core was still warm when they opened the housing. That should not have been possible. The temperature at that depth is permanently negative. I am mentioning that because it became important later, and because I want to be precise about what happened next. If you work in deep earth projects, if you have been part of research that was supposed to be confidential, if you have seen data that did not match the official explanations, subscribe and share this with someone who thinks they would have handled what happened better than we did. If you want to hear the full core analysis reports and the correspondence that came after the documents that were supposed to be destroyed, that material is available for channel members who want to understand the real scope of what we actually discovered. My name is Marcus, and I had been working drilling and core analysis for 14 years before I was recruited for the Arctic project. I had worked in the Gulf of Mexico, in the North Sea, in Southeast Asia, I understood how deep drilling worked, how to interpret geological samples, how to manage equipment under extreme conditions. I had spent enough time on platforms and in remote locations to understand the difference between standard commercial drilling and the other kind, the kind where the work is officially conducted under private contract, but where the government is paying attention to every single result. The Beaufort Sea project was supposed to be exploratory, deep drilling research. The official story was that we were studying permafrost destabilization and ancient geological formations. We were measuring temperature gradients, collecting core samples, monitoring subsurface conditions. The kind of work that gets published in academic journals and contributes to climate modeling. We were not supposed to be looking for anything alive. We were certainly not supposed to find it. The project was based at a small research station on a lease near the coast. The station consisted of 4 buildings: living quarters, lab space, equipment storage, and a generator facility. The drilling rig was positioned about a mile away, accessible by a gravel road that was only passable in the winter months when the ground was frozen solid enough to support vehicle weight. The project ran from October through March. During the summer, the site was essentially abandoned except for minimal maintenance crews. I had been brought on as the core analysis lead, which meant I was responsible for examining every sample that came up from the hole and documenting the geological properties. My supervisor was a man named Richard, who had been in the Arctic research community for nearly 20 years. Richard was professionally guarded and selective about what information he shared. He had made it very clear during my hiring conversation that the project had security protocols, that I would be signing non-disclosure agreements, and that certain findings would not be included in public reports. I had accepted those conditions because the pay was excellent, and because I was professionally curious about what kind of work required that level of compartmentalization. I arrived at the station in early October 2015. The weather was already brutal, temperatures dropping below -30 Fahrenheit on clear nights, wind patterns that made outdoor work hazardous for more than short periods at a time. There were 8 of us working the station: Richard, myself, 2 drilling operators named David and James, a geophysicist named Elena, who was monitoring the seismic data from the borehole, a logistics manager named Susan, who managed supplies and communications, a medical technician named Pavel, and a cook named Margaret, who kept us functioning on a schedule that was difficult under the best circumstances. We were a small, isolated team with limited ability to leave the site. Supply runs happened every 2 weeks if weather permitted. Communication with the outside world was handled through email and satellite phone, which meant that no conversation was immediate. There was a genuine sense of separation from normal life. We were committed to the work and to each other because there was no alternative. The first 3 weeks of the project proceeded exactly as I had been told to expect. We performed preliminary drilling operations, established baseline data, collected shallow core samples to understand the basic subsurface structure. The samples I was examining during those weeks were consistent with geological models: permafrost layers, ancient ice-rich sediments, typical Arctic geology. Richard was satisfied with the progress. The drilling operators reported no equipment issues. Elena was monitoring the seismic signatures and found nothing unusual. Everything was working as designed. Then we reached the depth of 7,000 feet. At that depth, I began to notice something unusual in the core samples. The sediment changed character. Instead of the typical compressed and frozen soil and mineral composition, the cores started to show a different structure. The material was denser, but it also appeared to have some kind of organized arrangement. The particles seemed to be aligned in a pattern rather than randomly distributed as you would expect from geological compression. I brought this observation to Richard, thinking it might indicate some kind of unusual mineral formation, or perhaps a layer of volcanic ash or processed material from an ancient atmospheric event. Richard examined the samples carefully. He was quiet for longer than I expected him to be. Then he said, "This is within the parameters we discussed. Continue documenting precisely. Do not speculate about the cause. Just record what you observe. There was something in his tone that suggested he had anticipated this result. I had not been expecting that. I asked him if this was a known geological feature. He said that we would understand more as we continued deeper. Then he closed the conversation and returned to the communications building. I spent the rest of that evening carefully examining the core samples under magnification. The alignment pattern in the material was undeniable. Whatever had created that pattern, it was not random geological process. It looked almost deliberate, like something had organized the particles or arranged them in response to some force or pressure. I documented the samples with photographs and detailed notes. I did not speculate. I just recorded what I saw over the next 2 weeks. As the drill went deeper, the material in the cores became increasingly organized. By the time we had reached 8,000 feet, the samples were showing structures that could only be described as layered and composed. The material was still frozen, still rock hard, but it had taken on characteristics that suggested it was not purely inorganic. I brought this to Richard again. He said, "We are entering a region of high interest. Increase the documentation frequency. I want photographs and detailed measurements of every sample. Anything unusual should be recorded with exact depth notation and timestamp." I understood what was happening. The drilling was aimed at finding something specific. The anomalies in the core samples were not incidental findings. They were the purpose of the project. I had been brought on to analyze what we found and to document it properly. Richard had known what we would find. The government had funded this project because they wanted to know what was down there. By the time we reached 8,500 feet, the core samples had changed dramatically. The material was still dense and frozen, but it had taken on an appearance that looked almost organic. The structure suggested something that had once held form, that had some kind of internal organization. It was not fossilized bone or wood. It was not recognizable as any known biological material. But it was clearly not purely geological either. I was examining a sample under high magnification when Elena came into the lab. Elena was the geophysicist, and she was normally focused on her seismic readings and did not spend much time in the core analysis lab. She asked me if I was seeing what she was seeing in the drill data. I asked her what she meant. She said that starting around 8,000 feet, the seismic signatures coming from below the borehole had changed. She said they were showing patterns that suggested a void space, an open cavity below the borehole. She said that, according to the seismic data, there was something large underneath us, something hollow or empty or structurally different from the surrounding geology. She said that Richard had already reviewed the data and had told her to continue monitoring without mentioning it to anyone else. I asked Elena what she thought was down there. She looked at the sample I had been examining and asked what I thought was down there. I said I did not know, but that the material I was examining was not natural. Elena said that it was definitely not natural, and that Richard was handling this project the way you would handle a classified military matter, with compartmentalized information and a need-to-know protocol. She said that whatever they found when they broke through to the void space below us, they were prepared for it to be something significant. The drill reached 9,000 feet at 6 in the morning on November 20th. I was asleep when it happened, but David, one of the drilling operators, woke me with an urgent radio call saying that I needed to come to the drilling rig immediately. The sample chamber had opened, and there was something that I needed to see before Richard decided what to do with it. I was outside in negative 25-degree weather within 10 minutes. The drill rig was illuminated by powerful floodlights, and I could see the sample chamber being carefully extracted from the borehole by the hydraulic arm. The chamber was covered in frost, and it was actively steaming, releasing vapor into the cold air. That was the first obvious impossibility. The sample chamber should have been colder than the surrounding air. Instead, it was warm enough to create visible condensation. We brought the chamber inside the lab and sealed the door. Richard was already there, along with Elena and Pavel. Nobody was speaking. We were all focused on the chamber, waiting to see what would be in it. The chamber was designed to open along a hinged access panel. Richard used a specially designed key to unlock the mechanism. The seal released with a sound like escaping pressure, like something had been pressurized inside the sealed chamber. Then Richard opened the access panel. The material inside the chamber was what I had been seeing in the core fragments, but intact. It was an object, clearly. It was approximately the size and shape of a human hand, but the structure was wrong. It had what looked like fingers, but they were arranged differently than human fingers would be. The material was dark, almost black in color, and it appeared to be smooth and almost crystalline in texture. It was still warm. I could see the frost melting on the surface where it had been exposed to the warmer air of the lab. The object was undeniably alive, or had been alive, or existed in some state that was not consistent with being dead or inanimate. I did not touch it. None of us touched it. We stood around the chamber and looked at the object, and I think each of us was processing the same realization that what we had found at 9,000 feet deep was something that did not belong to any known biological taxonomy. It was not a fossil. It was not a mineral. It was an artifact of something, or something itself, and it had been preserved in the permafrost for an unknown amount of time. Richard said, very quietly, "This is what we are looking for. This confirms the research trajectory. I need to contact headquarters and inform them of the discovery. Until I do that, this object remains sealed and documented exactly as it is. Nobody discusses this with anyone outside this building. Nobody makes calls or sends messages about this. Everyone is now operating under explicit non-disclosure protocols, with legal and criminal consequences if information is leaked." He paused, and then he said, "The project just changed. We are no longer conducting exploratory drilling. We are now in recovery and analysis phase. For the next several hours, we documented everything. We photographed the object from every angle. We measured it precisely. We took temperatures of the material. We analyzed the frost patterns. We examined the sample chamber for any signs of contamination or damage that might indicate the object had deteriorated or changed during the drilling process. The object did not move. It did not respond to stimulus. It appeared to be inert, despite being warm. The warmth was not decreasing. The object maintained its temperature without any source of heat. By noon, Richard had established a new protocol. The object would be kept in a specialized containment chamber in the lab. The temperature would be carefully controlled. Nobody would be allowed in the lab except myself, Elena, and Richard. The drilling would pause while we assessed what had happened and what the next steps should be. Richard said that he was expecting instructions from the agencies that were funding the project, and that we needed to be prepared for different scenarios, including the possibility that we would be instructed to seal the borehole permanently and abandon the site. Elena asked what we had actually found. Richard said, "I do not know. I have theories, but I cannot confirm any of them without further study and authorization. What I can tell you is that what we found 9,000 feet below the permafrost surface is not something that should exist according to contemporary geological and biological science. It represents either a gap in our understanding of what is possible, or it represents something that has been deliberately concealed or hidden beneath the ice." Over the next several days, Richard maintained complete operational security. We continued to eat with the rest of the team, but we did not discuss the discovery. The drilling operators noticed that the drilling had stopped, and they were concerned about the project timeline. Richard told them that we had encountered unexpected geological conditions, and that we were reassessing our approach. It was a partial truth. We were reassessing our approach, just not in the way they thought. The communication that came from the funding agencies took 5 days to arrive. Richard conducted the conversation through secure satellite phone from the locked communications building. When he emerged, he looked exhausted and deeply concerned. He called Elena and myself into a private meeting in his quarters. He said that the agencies wanted the object recovered and transported to a secure facility, but that they did not want to risk any equipment failures or contamination during transport. They wanted us to maintain the object in its current state and to prepare the lab for long-term storage and study until transport could be arranged. He said that additional personnel would be arriving on the next available supply run, which was scheduled for 5 days away. Those personnel would establish a secure protocol for the object and would oversee its eventual removal from the site. In the meantime, Richard said that Elena and I needed to accelerate our analysis. They wanted a comprehensive report on the object's properties, its composition, any signs of biological activity, and our best assessment of how old it was and how it came to be embedded 9,000 feet below the surface. I spent the next 72 hours examining that object in ways that I had never examined a geological sample before. I used every analytical tool we had available. I took samples from the surface of the object, examining them under magnification. I measured electromagnetic properties. I assessed density. I tested for signs of chemistry, for responses to stimuli, for anything that might indicate the nature of the material. I want to be precise about what I discovered, because the finding changed everything. The object was not fossilized. The material was not ancient sediment that had been compressed into a humanoid shape. The material was something different. It was crystalline at the microscopic level, but it had an organized structure that suggested growth or development, not random crystal formation. The crystalline matrix contained trace elements of compounds that I could not identify. They did not match any known mineral composition. They were present in patterns that suggested intentional arrangement, not random distribution. But there was something else. Inside the crystal matrix, embedded within the material, were structures that looked almost like circuitry. I could see patterns of conductive pathways, nodes of denser material that appeared to connect to other nodes. The structures were microscopic, but they were undeniably there. They were organized. They suggested purpose. They suggested that what I was examining was not a natural object. It was manufactured, or it had grown according to some internal instruction or programming. It was technology, or it was biology operating under a technological principle. I brought my findings to Richard. I showed him the microscopy images. I explained what I had observed. I asked him if this was something he had expected. He looked at the photographs for a long time without responding. Then he said, "This is beyond the scope of anything I was briefed on. I need to contact headquarters again and inform them that we are not dealing with a fossil or a preserved biological specimen. We are dealing with something that is either an artifact or an organism that functions as an artifact." That communication took place in the evening. It was a long conversation, and I could only hear Richard's side of it through the door of the communications building. He was asking questions about authorization, about what the next steps would be, about whether they had expected this particular finding. At one point, he raised his voice and said, "I understand the implications. The question is how to proceed without contaminating the sample or putting the team at risk." When he ended the call, Richard looked different. He looked like someone who had just received information that fundamentally changed his understanding of a situation. He called Elena and myself together again. He said that the funding agencies had confirmed that they were aware of the possibility that what we found might have technological components. He said that they had previous information suggesting that something unusual existed at depth in this region of the Arctic. He said that the drilling project had been designed to locate that something and to assess its nature. He said that the agencies were now concerned about a secondary problem. He said that the borehole we had drilled had disturbed something. He said that seismic monitoring had detected activity below the borehole at depths beyond where we had recovered the object. He said that there was evidence of movement, of displacement, of something responding to the intrusion of the borehole into the subsurface void space. He said that we needed to be prepared for the possibility that what we had recovered was not the only thing at that depth. Then he said something that changed my understanding of the danger we were in. He said, the cores you examined from 8,000 to 9,000 feet, they contained biological material that was active. They contained trace evidence of metabolic processes, chemical reactions that should not be occurring in frozen material. I had the initial analysis done before I contacted the agencies. The material was not dead, it was dormant. The object we recovered was the source of the signal that Elena detected in the seismic data. It was not empty space under the borehole. It is something. And it knew we were drilling down toward it. I did not sleep well after that conversation. I understood what Richard was implying. The object we had recovered was not a passive artifact waiting to be found. It was part of something larger. It was capable of generating signals that could be detected by seismic equipment. It was aware of the borehole, of the drilling, of our intrusion into the subsurface space where it existed. And what we had done by drilling down 9,000 feet was announce our presence to something that had been hidden for an unknown amount of time. The next morning, the station's communication system went down. Susan, the logistics manager, reported that the satellite uplink was no longer functioning. The equipment showed no signs of physical damage. The connections were intact. The power supply was stable. But the system simply was not transmitting or receiving signals. It was as if something had severed the connection without actually severing the physical link. Richard was concerned, but not surprised. He said that there could be a technical reason for the outage, but that we should be prepared for the possibility that we would not be able to communicate with the outside world until the issue was resolved. He said that the supply run was still scheduled for 2 days away, and that the team coming in would bring whatever equipment and personnel we needed. He said we should continue with our analysis of the object and prepare the lab for the arrival of the additional team. But he also said something that revealed his true concern. He said, if the communication outage is not accidental, then we need to understand what the implications are. If the object we recovered is part of a larger system, and if that system is capable of disrupting our communications, then we need to modify our containment protocols. The object should remain sealed and undisturbed. Nobody should attempt to study it further until the new team arrives and can assess the risks. I asked him if he thought the object was dangerous. He said, I think the object is a component of something that we do not understand. I think that something might have capabilities that we do not anticipate. I think that recovering the object may have triggered a response from whatever it is part of. And I think that the most prudent course of action is to minimize our interaction with the object and maintain secure containment until we have backup and additional expertise on site. That was when things began to deteriorate. The communication system remained offline. Richard attempted to repair it, checking every connection and every component. He found nothing wrong. The system simply was not functioning. By the evening of that day, he called all of us together and announced that we were entering a contingency protocol. We would remain at the station. We would continue our normal work routine. We would not attempt to leave the site. We would assume that the communication outage was temporary, and that the supply run would still arrive as scheduled. If the supply run did not arrive, we would reassess and prepare for a longer period of isolation. But beneath that calm announcement, there was fear. I could see it in Richard's face, and in the faces of the other team members who had not been told about the object or about the seismic activity below the borehole. The isolation that we had previously experienced as a normal part of Arctic research had taken on a different character. We were isolated not just by geography and weather, but by the deliberate cutting of our communication with the outside world. Elena came to my quarters that night. She said that the seismic data was showing continued activity below the borehole. The signals were becoming more organized. They were creating patterns that she could almost interpret, but not quite. They looked like they might be communication, like they might be signals being sent upward from the depths. She said that Richard had instructed her not to tell anyone else, but she thought I should know. She said that whatever was down there was responding to the borehole, and the response was accelerating. I asked her if she thought the signals were directed at us, or if they were directed at the object we had recovered. She said that she did not know, but that the frequency and intensity of the signals had increased dramatically in the hours since Richard had announced the communication outage. She said that it was possible that the signals had caused the outage, but she had no evidence of how that would be physically possible. She said that nothing in her training had prepared her for the possibility that seismic signals could be modulated to disrupt electronic communications equipment. Then Elena asked me something that I had been afraid to articulate. What if the object we recovered is a probe? What if it is a device that was sent to gather information about our world, and what we have done by recovering it is capture one part of a system that is still trying to complete its mission? I did not have an answer to that question. I still do not have an answer. The supply run did not arrive as scheduled. A storm system moved into the region on the afternoon of the day when the aircraft was supposed to land. The weather was severe wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour, visibility near zero, temperature dropping toward -40. Richard received a radio communication from the logistics company handling the supply run, informing him that the flight had been canceled due to unsafe conditions. They said the next available window for a supply run would be approximately 1 week away, dependent on weather conditions. That communication came through on a portable radio system that had been in storage since we arrived at the site. The main communication system was still offline. The fact that the portable radio still worked suggested that whatever had disabled the main system had been targeted, not a general electromagnetic disruption. Richard seemed to interpret this as a sign that we were not completely cut off, but I interpreted it as evidence that something was specifically preventing us from contacting the outside world using our primary communication infrastructure. During the next 3 days, a series of events occurred that escalated the situation beyond what any contingency protocol had anticipated. On the first evening, David, one of the drilling operators, reported that the drill rig had been sabotaged. The drill string had been disconnected, and the equipment had been deliberately powered down. The hydraulic systems showed signs of having been manually depressurized. Nobody had been near the rig during the day when we were all accounted for. Richard examined the rig and confirmed David's assessment. Someone, or something, had accessed the drilling equipment and disabled it. The next morning, we discovered that the generator facility had been breached. The door was open, and the interior showed signs of disturbance. Some of the fuel canisters had been moved. Richard immediately ordered a full inventory of all supplies, including fuel, food, and water. The inventory revealed that nothing was missing, but that significant quantities had been redistributed. Someone had organized the supplies in the facility, stacking and arranging items in a pattern that made no practical sense, but that looked deliberate. That evening, Elena reported that the seismic signals from below the borehole had ceased. The activity that had been increasing for days was suddenly silent. The subsurface void space, which had been showing continuous signatures of movement and signal transmission, had gone completely quiet. Elena said that the silence was almost more disturbing than the activity had been, because it suggested that whatever was generating the signals had completed its mission or had transferred its attention to something else. I was in the lab when Pavel, the medical technician, came in and asked to speak with me privately. He said that he had noticed something unusual about the containment chamber holding the object. He said that the temperature readings for the object had changed. The object was no longer maintaining its constant warmth. The temperature was fluctuating, rising and falling in patterns that suggested the object was responding to environmental changes. He said that Richard had not yet noticed because Richard had not checked the containment readings since the morning. Pavel said that he was concerned about what the temperature fluctuations might indicate. I immediately went to check the containment chamber. Pavel was correct. The temperature readout showed a clear pattern of fluctuation. The object was cycling through higher and lower temperatures in a rhythmic pattern. The cycle was approximately 90 seconds from peak to minimum. The pattern was consistent and repeating. It was undeniably a response to something, not random fluctuation. I photographed the temperature readings and brought them to Richard. Richard's response was immediate and severe. He said that we were no longer going to maintain the containment chamber under passive observation. He said that we were going to implement emergency protocols. He said that the object was to be sealed in a reinforced storage container, and that storage container was to be physically removed from the main lab and stored in a secure location outside the primary station buildings. He said that I should prepare the object for transport within the next 2 hours, and that we would move it that evening under controlled security protocols. I asked him if he thought the object was dangerous. He said, "I think the object is communicating. I think those temperature fluctuations are a signal. I think that we have made a fundamental error in judgment by removing this object from the subsurface environment where it has existed in stable dormancy for however long it has been there. I think that the best course of action now is to contain it in a way that minimizes any potential for it to affect the station systems or to pose a direct threat to the team." Moving the object was the most difficult part of any work one had done on the project. Richard insisted on absolute security during the transport. He locked down all the buildings. He stationed Pavel at the main entrance with instructions to prevent anyone from leaving until the object had been moved. The object itself was sealed in a triple-layered containment unit first, the original sample chamber, then a specialized steel box, then a reinforced steel case that was designed to be resistant to environmental damage and contamination. We carried the case outside into conditions of extreme cold and dark. The temperature was -37 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was strong enough that standing required active effort to maintain balance. We transported the case to a small storage building that sat about 100 meters from the main station buildings. The storage building had been used for equipment overflow and seasonal supplies. Richard unlocked it, and we placed the case on a concrete pad in the center of the building. Richard locked the door, and we returned to the main station. As I was removing my outer gear in the entrance vestibule, I felt something that I had not expected to feel. I felt the temperature change. The station was cold. Normally, the temperature in the living quarters was usually maintained at around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which felt warm compared to the outside, but was genuinely cold compared to normal indoor conditions. But suddenly, the temperature in the station dropped. The indoor thermometer, which hung in the common area, showed the temperature falling from 55 degrees to below 40 in the space of a few minutes. Richard noticed it immediately. He checked the heating system and found that the furnace was still functioning normally. The fuel was steady, the burner was functioning correctly, but the heat was not reaching the living spaces effectively. It was as if something was draining the heat from the building pulling the warmth out of the air faster than the furnace could replace it. Margaret, the cook, reported that the food storage areas were experiencing the same temperature drop. She said that the freezer units, which normally maintained a steady 0 degrees Fahrenheit, were now reading below -20. She said that it was as if the entire station was being selectively cooled from outside. Richard made a decision that revealed how serious he thought the situation had become. He said that we should all move to the communications building and seal the other structures. He said that he was going to attempt to restart the communication system, and that we needed to establish contact with the outside world immediately. We gathered in the communications building, all 8 of us, and Richard set about attempting to repair or restart the main communication system. He worked for approximately an hour without success. The system still showed no signs of power, no indication of functionality. He then attempted to establish communication using the portable radio that had received the weather update. The radio crackled to life, but instead of the expected commercial radio traffic or response from the logistics company, we heard something different. We heard a pattern of sounds, not speech, but a rhythmic pattern of tones. Tones that matched the frequency and timing of the seismic signals that Elena had been monitoring below the borehole. The tones were coming through the radio, which should have been impossible because the radio was tuned to a specific commercial frequency and should not have been able to receive signals outside that frequency band. Yet the tones were clear and undeniable. Elena looked at me, and I could see the realization in her expression. She said, "The signals are not coming from below anymore. They are coming from the equipment. They are using our own communication systems to transmit." That was when I fully understood the nature of the problem. The object we had recovered was not isolated or contained. It was part of a larger system that existed both beneath the borehole and potentially throughout the electromagnetic infrastructure of the station. The temperature drop was not a malfunction or environmental accident. It was deliberate. The cutting of communication, the disabling of the drill rig, the disturbance of the generator facility, all of it was coordinated. All of it was part of a response to our presence, our drilling, our recovery of the object. Something was actively managing our situation. Something was using our equipment to communicate. Something was manipulating our environment to accomplish objectives that we could not yet understand. Richard made a decision that, in retrospect, was both logical and catastrophic. He said that we needed to investigate what was actually happening at the borehole site. He said that if something was using our communication systems and our equipment, then we needed to verify whether the borehole itself was still intact or whether something had emerged from the subsurface void space. He said that he would take James, one of the drilling operators, and David, the other drilling operator, to the borehole site to conduct a physical assessment. He said that the rest of us should remain in the communications building and maintain security. I told him that I thought leaving the station during this situation was extremely dangerous. I said that we did not know what we were dealing with or what its capabilities were. I said that going to the borehole site, which was isolated and remote from the main station buildings, represented exactly the kind of vulnerability that it seemed the unknown entity was attempting to exploit. Richard listened to my concerns, but he said that we needed information, and the only way to get information was to visually inspect the borehole site. He took a portable radio and a high-powered flashlight. David and James prepared a vehicle, one of the small heated exploration trucks that we used for emergency site visits. They loaded fuel and emergency supplies. Richard told the rest of us that they would conduct the assessment and return within 2 hours. If they did not return within that time frame, we were to assume that something had gone wrong and we were to prepare for an emergency evacuation. They left the station at approximately 11:30 p.m. The station was dark, except for the lights inside the buildings. The wind outside was steady. The temperature continued to drop. I stayed in the communications building with the others, and we waited for the radio to crackle with updates. The first radio transmission came at approximately 12:15 a.m. It was David's voice, and he sounded strained. He said, "We have a situation. The borehole is not sealed. There is activity at the borehole site. There is something emerging from the hole. We are proceeding with extreme caution to document what we are seeing." There was interference on the radio, crackling and distortion that suggested either signal degradation or deliberate jamming. I wanted to hear more, but there was no further transmission. We all stood in the communications building, listening to the radio frequency, waiting for the next update. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. No further communication. Elena tried to raise them on the radio, calling their names and asking for status updates. There was no response. There was only the sound of radio static. At approximately 12:45 a.m., Richard's voice came through on the radio. The transmission was broken and distorted. I could hear words, but not complete sentences. "Back to station. Do not attempt recovery. Object must remain sealed. Containment has failed. Something has emerged." The transmission ended abruptly. Then, there was nothing. I was no longer thinking like a geologist or a research analyst. I was thinking like someone who understood that a situation had escalated beyond control. We had no communication with the team at the borehole. We had no clear understanding of what they were facing. We had no idea if they were in immediate danger or if the situation was manageable. And we were isolated in a remote Arctic station in conditions that made external rescue impossible. Pavel was the one who suggested that we might have only limited time before whatever was emerging from the borehole reached the station. He said that the borehole was 1 mile away, and that if something was moving from the borehole toward the station, it would reach us before dawn. He said that we should prepare to leave. He said that we should load supplies and prepare to move away from the station in the event that we needed to evacuate. Susan, the logistics manager, said that evacuating in these weather conditions would be as dangerous as staying. She said that we did not have the equipment or fuel to mount a long-term emergency journey across Arctic terrain. She said that our only realistic option was to remain at the station and maintain secure protocols until either the external team returned or outside assistance became possible. But something changed in the physical environment of the station around 1 a.m. The temperature inside the communication building dropped suddenly. The thermometer that showed outdoor temperature, which had been reading -38 degrees, suddenly dropped to -45, then -50. Inside the building, where we were, the temperature was falling as well. The heating system continued to function, but it was losing the battle against the cold that was somehow being imposed from outside. Elena was monitoring the seismic data on the portable equipment we had brought into the building. She said that the signals had resumed. She said that they were no longer coming from directly below the borehole. The signals were moving. They were coming from different locations, triangulating toward the station from multiple directions. She said that the signals were organized and complex, suggesting deliberate movement and communication among multiple entities. Richard's voice came through the radio again, hours later, when I had almost given up hope of hearing from him. The transmission was brief and clear. It said, "The thing at the borehole is not singular. There are multiple structures below the surface. Our presence here has activated a response. We are proceeding back to the station with photographic evidence and equipment samples. Prepare for arrival in approximately 90 minutes. Do not attempt to leave the communication building. Do not engage with anything you observe outside. Containment protocols remain in effect. The recovered object must remain sealed." But they did not arrive in 90 minutes. They did not arrive at all. What happened after that requires careful explanation, because the sequence of events was confusing, and my memory of the timeline became unreliable as the situation deteriorated. I remember the cold getting more intense. I remember the thermometers in the building showing temperatures that should not have been survivable in an enclosed space with functioning heating systems. I remember the radio going completely silent around 4 a.m. with no further transmissions from the borehole team or any external source. I remember Margaret suggesting that we might need to consider that Richard, David, and James were not coming back. I remember the discussion becoming increasingly urgent about what we should do. Do we attempt a rescue mission to the borehole site? Do we attempt to evacuate the entire station? Do we seal ourselves into a single building and assume a defensive posture? Do we try to establish communication using means other than the radio systems? The decision we eventually made was to investigate what had happened to the vehicle that had taken the borehole team. We decided that Elena and I would prepare equipment for a brief expedition to the borehole site to determine if the vehicle was still there and if there were any signs of what had happened to the team. We prepared carefully, gathering extra fuel, thermal protective gear, emergency equipment, and communication devices. We were equipped to survive for at least 4 hours if necessary. We left the station at approximately 6 a.m. The weather outside was brutal. The temperature was -45 degrees. The wind was steady and harsh. The darkness was complete. There would be no sun for hours, and we were operating entirely on the power of our vehicle lights and handheld flashlights. The road to the borehole site was a white plain of snow and ice. The vehicle moved carefully, and I was acutely aware that if we became stranded on this road, we would have very limited time before the cold would kill us. We reached the borehole site at approximately 6:30 a.m. The area was illuminated by the floodlights that had been installed around the drilling rig, and what I saw will never leave me. The drill rig was still intact, still functional, still operational, but the drill string was no longer in place. The borehole itself was open, completely open, with no cap or sealing mechanism. And emerging from the borehole was a structure. I cannot describe it with complete accuracy because my mind could not process what I was seeing. It was not an object. It was not a single entity. It was a formation, a structure that rose from the borehole opening and extended upward into the darkness. The structure was composed of the same dark crystalline material that the recovered object was made from. It was approximately 40 feet tall, tapering toward the top, with branching extensions that reached outward like fingers or antennae. The surface was shimmering, reflecting the light from our floodlights with an iridescent quality that suggested the material was not static, but actively responsive to illumination. Elena and I exited the vehicle, and we approached the structure carefully. As we got closer, I could see that it was generating heat. The air around it was warmer than the surrounding temperature, and there was visible distortion from the heat signature. The structure was still growing. I could see movement at its base, where new material was emerging from the borehole and solidifying into crystalline form, extending the height and complexity of the structure. I searched the immediate area for signs of Richard, David, or James. I found the heated truck they had been driving, parked about 100 meters from the borehole site. The vehicle was running, still running, even though they had left it hours ago. The fuel was nearly depleted. When I opened the driver's side door, I found that the interior was ice, completely frozen despite the fact that the vehicle had been running continuously and should have been maintaining internal temperature. I looked inside the vehicle, and I did not find Richard, David, or James. I found their outerwear. Their protective gear was stacked neatly on the front and back seats, as if the three men had systematically removed their clothing. I found Richard's portable radio, placed deliberately on the front dashboard. I found David's emergency pack and first aid kit. I found James's thermal suit, carefully arranged on the back seat. But I did not find the three men. Elena came to the vehicle and saw the same thing I had seen. She did not speak. She simply looked at the empty cab and the arranged clothing and understood what I was understanding. that the three men were no longer at the borehole site. They had left the vehicle. They had removed their protective gear. They had left their equipment. They had exposed themselves to the extreme cold. And they were gone. I did not require Elena to verbalize what I was already thinking. I knew exactly where they had gone. They had gone toward the structure emerging from the borehole. They had approached it with their protective clothing removed, voluntarily exposing themselves to the lethal cold. And they had not returned. I took Richard's portable radio from the vehicle. I attempted to transmit a message to the station. I said that the borehole was compromised, that a large structure was emerging from the subsurface, that the team was missing, and that we were returning to the station immediately. I do not know if the message was received. The radio produced only static. We returned to the vehicle we had come in, and we drove back toward the station as quickly as the road conditions would allow. Neither Elena nor I spoke during that drive. We were both processing what we had witnessed, and we were both probably reaching the same conclusion that the structure we had seen was not a passive emergence. It was an active formation, and it was drawing humans toward it. It was a lure or an interface, and the three men who had approached it had not survived the encounter. We arrived back at the station and immediately reported what we had seen to the remaining team members. The reaction was fear mixed with a sense of grim acceptance. Pavel said that we were now facing a situation where rescue was impossible and external help was unlikely to arrive in time to matter. He said that we needed to accept that we were in a survival situation and that our options were extremely limited. Susan suggested that we attempt one more communication using every system available to us. She worked on the radio systems for several hours, attempting different frequencies and transmission methods. She was finally able to establish a brief contact with the emergency frequency used by the Arctic Rescue Services. The contact was fragmentary and lasted only seconds, but she was able to relay information about our situation, that we had a major discovery site with unexplained phenomena, that team members were missing, that we were isolated and unable to provide detailed information about our exact location and needs. The response we received was that rescue operations were not possible due to weather conditions, but that information about our situation had been logged and that monitoring would continue. The emergency services said that we should remain in place, maintain our power and heating systems, and await a recovery window when weather conditions improved. They said that they would attempt to establish contact again in 12 hours. That conversation concluded at approximately 1 p.m. on November 24th. At that point, I understood that we were effectively abandoned. We were too far from any external assistance, in conditions too severe for any intervention, with a situation that was too unexplained for anyone on the outside to understand or respond to effectively. We had 6 people remaining at the station: Elena, Pavel, Susan, Margaret, myself, and 1 additional technician named Robert, who had been maintaining equipment and had not been directly involved in the project analysis. We had limited fuel, limited food supplies, and an unknown threat that appeared to be generating structures and manipulating our environment using methods we could not comprehend. That night, the temperature inside the station reached -15 degrees Fahrenheit, despite our heating system operating at maximum capacity. We sealed the main station building and moved everyone into the communications building, where we used emergency heaters and focused our remaining fuel on maintaining that single space at survivable temperature. We set up a rotation for monitoring the radio, the seismic equipment, and the exterior conditions. It was Elena who first noticed a pattern in the seismic data. Around 3 a.m. on November 25th, she said that the signals were no longer coming from below the borehole. They were coming from different locations, multiple locations, moving closer to the station. She said that the signals were organized in a way that suggested a coordinated approach from multiple directions. She said that the pattern looked like an assault, like something was methodically moving toward the station from all sides. Pavel suggested that we should physically inspect the exterior of the station to see if we could observe anything approaching. I said that was an extremely dangerous idea, given what we had seen at the borehole site and the temperature conditions outside. But Pavel was right, that we needed information about what was actually happening. He volunteered to conduct a brief exterior patrol, remaining in radio contact with us inside the building. Pavel put on complete protective gear layers of thermal suit, an insulated parka, face protection, thermal boots, insulated gloves. He was equipped for the cold. He was also equipped with a high-powered flashlight and carried a handheld radio. We let him out of the building and locked the door behind him. Inside, we monitored his transmissions as he conducted his patrol around the station. For approximately 4 minutes, Pavel described what he was observing. He said that there was unusual ground disturbance around the perimeter of the station. He said that the snow appeared to be disturbed in multiple locations, as if something had moved through it. He said that the disturbance pattern was deliberate, not random. It looked like something had circled the station multiple times, creating a pattern of tracks or movement in the snow. He said that the temperature outside was even colder than the instruments had indicated, and that his thermal suit was barely adequate protection for the conditions. Then Pavel said something that cut through all the professional analysis and established the reality of immediate danger. He said, "There is something moving behind the equipment storage building. Something large. I am seeing heat signature. I am seeing movement. I am returning to the station immediately." I could hear the door being forced against the frame as Pavel attempted entry. I heard Elena's voice instructing him to activate the emergency seals. I heard the door slam shut. And then Pavel was inside, gasping for air, covered in frost, his thermal suit degrading rapidly from the extreme cold exposure he had experienced in just those few minutes outside. Pavel was incoherent for several minutes as his core body temperature stabilized. He kept saying that there was something outside, something moving deliberately, something that did not match any known animal or environmental phenomenon. He said that he had seen heat signature, which meant that whatever was moving outside was generating thermal energy despite the lethal cold. Elena was monitoring the seismic data, and she said that the signals were now very close. She said that they were approaching the station from multiple directions, and that the signal strength was increasing as whatever was generating them got closer to the buildings. She said that the pattern suggested that the entities were coordinating their approach, that they were waiting for something, that they were surrounding us. Margaret suggested that we might need to consider that the entities outside, whatever they were not necessarily trying to kill us. She said that everything that had happened so far, including the disappearance of Richard and the drilling team, had occurred without any direct, violent assault. She said that it was possible that we were being contained or managed rather than directly attacked. I suggested that the distinction between management and attack was not particularly meaningful if the outcome was the same if we ended up dead or disappeared, regardless of the entity's intent. But Margaret's observation raised an important question. What did these entities want? What was the purpose of everything that had happened since we recovered the object from 9,000 feet deep? The answer came at approximately 5 a.m., when the communication system suddenly reactivated. The radio crackled with a transmission that was unmistakably not coming from the emergency services or any external source. The transmission was a sound pattern, a rhythmic sequence of tones that matched the seismic signals Elena had been monitoring. But this time, the transmission continued, modulated into something that resembled speech or communication. The pattern was repeated multiple times, identical each time. It took me a moment to understand that it was not speech in any human language. It was a message in a format that our equipment was capable of reproducing, but that was fundamentally not designed for human comprehension. The message was translated by our equipment into a visual readout, a sequence of numerical values that appeared on the radio frequency analyzer. Elena said that the numerical sequence was consistent with the pattern of the structure we had observed at the borehole site. She said that the numbers represented a frequency sequence, a series of harmonic relationships that might describe the physical properties of the structure. She said that if you translated those numbers into a three-dimensional model, you would get a form that matched what we had seen emerging from the borehole. But there was more to the message. There was a temporal component, a progression that suggested growth or development over time. There was a mathematical relationship that suggested intentionality, design, purpose. The message was not random. It was carefully constructed. It was trying to communicate information. Susan asked if the message was a threat or a warning. Elena said that it was neither. She said that the message was an explanation. She said that the entities outside were trying to explain what they were, what they had been doing, and what was going to happen next. What we understood, piecing together the information from the seismic data, the structure at the borehole site, the temperature anomalies, and the communication we had received, was that the objects at depth had not arrived recently. They had been there for an immeasurably long time, potentially millions of years. They had been dormant, preserved in the frozen subsurface, waiting in a state of complete stasis. What we had done by drilling 9,000 feet deep was wake them up. The recovery of the object, the probe, or the individual entity that we had removed from its position in the subsurface had triggered a response from the larger system below. The structure we observed at the borehole was a communication and construction mechanism. It was being built by something that was emerging from much deeper in the subsurface. The entities had taken Richard, David, and James because those three men had approached the structure voluntarily, perhaps because they were no longer capable of rational decision-making, perhaps because they were being influenced or controlled by the entity's presence. And now, the entities were approaching the station because the station contained the object we had recovered. The object was their property, or their component, or their child, or something that was fundamentally important to whatever mission or function they were pursuing. They wanted it back. The realization struck me at that moment: we had stolen something valuable, and the owners were coming to retrieve it. Elena said that based on the seismic patterns and the communication signals, she estimated that the entities would reach the station within the next 2 hours. She said that they were not moving aggressively, but they were moving with purpose and determination. She said that they appeared to be multiple in number. She was detecting at least 3 distinct signal sources moving toward the station from different directions. Pavel asked what we should do. What was the right choice? Do we attempt to escape? Do we attempt to confront whatever was approaching? Do we attempt to surrender the object and hope that the entities would leave us alone? Do we attempt to destroy the object and hope that removing what they wanted would cause them to abandon the site? Richard's instructions, transmitted before he disappeared, had been explicit. The recovered object must remain sealed. Containment protocols must remain in effect. The object must not be surrendered or destroyed under any circumstances. But Richard was gone. Richard's judgment, his authority, his understanding of what was actually at stake, had been removed from the equation. We were making decisions based on incomplete information and survival instincts. I made the decision that I still do not know if I regret or if I am relieved I made. I said that we should retrieve the object from the storage building where we had left it and bring it back to the main station. I said that we should prepare to meet whatever was approaching with the object in our possession and attempt communication or negotiation. I said that attempting to escape would be suicide. The vehicle fuel would not carry us far enough to reach safety, and the temperature conditions would kill us long before we reached any facility that could help. I said that our only option was to remain at the station and engage with whatever was coming toward us. Susan asked if I was suggesting we give them the object. I said that I was suggesting we position ourselves to negotiate the return of the object. if that was what they wanted. I said that we might be able to establish some kind of understanding with whatever was approaching, and that surrender or destruction of the object might not be the only option. Margaret said that I was operating from the belief that the entities were rational and could be negotiated with. She said that we had no evidence to support that assumption. She said that the entities had already taken 3 men, had disabled our equipment, had manipulated our environment, and had surrounded the station. She said that negotiation implied that they might be willing to accept something other than complete compliance with their desires. But Pavel agreed with me. He said that we had no other viable options, and that attempting to maintain a confrontation or engaging in negotiation was at least an active choice rather than passive waiting for whatever was about to happen. We moved to the storage building and retrieved a containment case holding the recovered object. We brought it back to the station and prepared it for presentation. I say presentation because it became clear that this was no longer about scientific analysis or secure containment. This was about meeting the entity that had created the object, if indeed it was something that had been created and was not something that had evolved or been grown. The entities reached the station at exactly 6:47 a.m. on November 25th. I remember the exact time because we were monitoring it on every clock in the building. The seismic signals peaked simultaneously from 3 different directions, and the ground beneath the station began to vibrate. Not violently, it was more like a rhythmic movement, a pulsing that suggested something enormous was moving through the subsurface or along the ground surface just beneath the snow and ice. Then we heard a sound. It was not a roar or a scream. It was a sustained harmonic tone, a frequency that seemed to resonate through the building itself. The tone was the same pattern we had heard on the radio transmissions, translated into an audible range. The tone caused visible vibrations in the physical structures of the building. We could see dust and frost particles vibrating in the air, could feel the resonance in our bodies. The front door of the station began to open. Not because anyone opened it from inside, but because something outside was opening it. The door swung inward slowly, and we could see the Arctic darkness beyond, illuminated only by the distant floodlights from the drill site. And something stepped through the doorway. I do not have adequate vocabulary to describe what I saw. My eyes were able to process the visual information, but my brain could not make complete sense of it. It was large, approximately 10 feet tall, and it was composed of the same dark crystalline material that the object we had recovered was made from. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long. The head section was too large relative to the torso. The movements were not quite consistent with human biomechanics. There was a smoothness to the motion that suggested a different principle of movement, a different architecture of joints and muscles. But the most disturbing aspect was that I could perceive intelligence in it. It was aware. It was observing us. It was communicating through its presence alone, expressing something that transcended the need for language or conventional signals. I felt, without any rational basis for that feeling, that I was being evaluated, assessed, understood at a level more profound than any human interaction had ever achieved. Elena made a sound. I do not remember what the sound was, whether it was a gasp, or a word, or a scream. Her hand reached out and gripped my arm with a pressure that was painful. The entity in I was now certain it was an entity, a living intelligence inhabiting a physical form constructed from the crystalline material, did not move further into the building. It stood in the doorway, observing the space and the people in it. Behind it, I could see at least 2 other similar forms positioned outside in the snow. They were also observing, also waiting. The entity raised one of its long arms, and its hand, which had a configuration similar to the recovered object, but much larger and more complex, extended toward us. The motion was not aggressive. It was more like a gesture of communication, a reaching out with purpose, but without violence. Pavel stood up. He walked toward the entity, toward the extended hand. I wanted to stop him, but I could not move. No one could move. We were all paralyzed by the strangeness of what we were witnessing, by the fundamental violation of natural law that the presence of this entity represented. Pavel stepped into the doorway, and the entity's hand closed around him with surprising gentleness. Pavel did not resist. He allowed himself to be taken by the entity. As I watched, Pavel's form seemed to blur, to become less distinct. It looked like he was merging with the entity, or being absorbed by it, or transitioning into a state that I could not perceive or understand. Then the entity stepped backward, out into the snow, and Pavel was gone. The entity made a sound, the same harmonic tone we had heard through the radio and through the building, and the other two entities responded with identical tones. There was a conversation happening, a communication that used sound and perhaps other wavelengths that I could not perceive. Then the entity that had taken Pavel reached down and grasped the containment case holding the recovered object. The case, which had been sealed with locks and latches designed to resist tampering, simply opened. The entity removed the object, held it up briefly, and then placed it against the surface of its own torso. The object appeared to merge with the entity's body, disappearing into the crystalline structure. The entity looked at us one final time. The gaze, if it could be called a gaze, was penetrating and absolute. Then it turned and walked back out into the darkness. The other two entities followed, and they disappeared into the night. The door to the station swung closed on its own. The vibration that had been pulsing through the building ceased. The temperature, which had been dropping steadily, stabilized. Within minutes, the heating system began to restore warmth to the station. Margaret was the first person to speak. She said, "They took it. They took the object, and Pavel." Nobody responded. Nobody moved. We remained in silence for several hours, each processing what we had witnessed and what it meant. The rest of the story is simpler, though no less profound in its implications. A recovery flight arrived approximately 3 days later, when weather conditions finally improved. The flight carried a medical team and a secure recovery unit. We were transported back to a staging facility in Alaska. We were placed into a secure protocol where we were interviewed extensively about our experience. The official story, the story that was filed in whatever records the government maintains for classified projects, was that we had experienced an equipment malfunction and localized environmental anomaly that had resulted in the loss of 3 team members. The story did not mention the object, the structure at the borehole site, or the entities that had retrieved both the object and Pavel. The story certainly did not mention that Pavel had apparently willingly left with the entities, or that he had appeared to merge with the crystalline form they were composed of. But I have confirmation that at least part of what we experienced was real and documented. Approximately 8 months after the incident, I received a visitor at my apartment in Seattle. The visitor was a woman who identified herself as working for a government agency that she did not name. She said that she had reviewed the archived data from the project and that she wanted to conduct an informal interview about specific details of what we had observed. She asked me about the recovered object, about its properties and composition. She asked me about the structure that we had observed at the borehole site. She asked me about the entities and their capabilities. And most importantly, she asked me about Pavel, whether I believed that Pavel was still alive, and whether I believed that his merger with the entity had been voluntary or coerced. I told her that I believed Pavel had made a conscious choice to go with the entities. I told her that everything about the interaction had suggested that the entities were not hostile, but were performing an operation that they had intended to perform. I told her that I believed Pavel might still be alive, in some form, existing in a state that we could not understand from our current perspective. The woman did not confirm or deny any of this information. She simply said that the data I had provided was consistent with other evidence and observations that the government had gathered about similar incidents. She said that there were apparently multiple sites around the world where similar structures had been emerging from subsurface locations. She said that the phenomenon appeared to be accelerating, with more incidents occurring in the last 5 years than in the previous 50 years combined. Before she left, she asked me one final question. Do you believe the entities that recovered the object and took Pavel are hostile to human interests? I thought about that question for a long time. I thought about the way the entity had moved with intelligence and precision. I thought about the way it had taken Pavel with what appeared to be gentleness. I thought about the message it had communicated through the radio and seismic equipment. I thought about the fact that it had not attacked us, had not killed anyone, had allowed us to remain alive and functional, and capable of bearing witness to what had happened. I told her that I did not believe they were inherently hostile. I told her that I believed they were pursuing objectives that were important to them, and that those objectives included the recovery of certain objects, and perhaps the recruitment or integration of human beings into their activities. I told her that I did not know if those objectives were compatible with human survival and human interests, but I did not believe that they had demonstrated outright malevolence. She nodded, recorded my response, and left. That was 4 years ago. I no longer work as a drilling technician or core analyst. I work in a private consulting capacity, analyzing geological data for companies that operate in remote regions. I make considerably less money than I would if I continued in my previous field, but I have the flexibility to work independently and the ability to avoid highly publicized or classified projects. I receive occasional communications from Elena and Susan, who were similarly removed from classified project work after the incident. We do not discuss the project in any detail. We simply acknowledge that we survived something that changed how we understand the world, and that we have agreed, whether through formal instruction or intuitive understanding, to not speak publicly about the details of what occurred. But I am speaking publicly now, to whoever listens to this recording, because I believe people deserve to know that there are things at depth beneath the Earth's surface that are not geological. I believe people deserve to know that some of those things are capable of emerging and making contact with human civilization. And I believe people deserve to know that at least one human being, Pavel, made contact with these entities and chose to merge with them. And that choice might represent an opportunity or a threat that humanity is not currently prepared to evaluate. The borehole in the Beaufort Sea remains. The structure that emerged from it still exists, still grows, still functions according to purposes that I can only speculate about. The government, as far as I can determine, has not attempted to destroy it or retrieve it. They have simply cordoned off the area and established restricted access. They are probably monitoring it, probably collecting data, probably trying to understand what it is and what it will do next. And the question that I ask myself every day is whether the entities that came to retrieve the object and take Pavel are done with us, or whether they are simply waiting for something. I ask myself whether the emergence of structures at similar sites around the world means that they are establishing a presence on the surface, preparing for something, or simply following whatever programming or imperative drives their behavior. I still take the same road to work that passes near the coast where the Beaufort Sea lies. I no longer stop to observe the ocean. I no longer look toward the north, toward the location of the drilling station or the sites where the structures are emerging. I simply drive past and attempt to focus on the day-to-day work that keeps me functioning and employed, but I remain aware that 9,000 feet below me, beneath the permafrost and the rock and the ancient geological strata, something is waiting, something is building, something is growing, and it knows where we are.